Fog. Our artillery was processing the height in front of us, while a grenadier tank battalion was storming enemy positions. The young grenadiers moved as if they were on exercises. They could not be stopped either by machine gun or artillery fire. Countless, as it seemed, many soldiers were supported. Hello dear friends. You and I have already familiarized ourselves with the diary of a German corporal. This time I decided to turn to the general's memoirs in order to look at the events of World War II from a different angle. Today we will get acquainted with the memoirs of Major General Kurt Meyer of the Waffen-SS. The general who commanded the elite soldiers of the Third Reich. During the war, they committed countless war crimes. But we have to admit that on the battlefield it was a very formidable opponent, well-trained, disciplined, and extremely uncompromising. The more you learn about them, the more you begin to admire the people who broke the back of such a formidable enemy. Major General of the Waffen-SS Kurt Meyer describes the battles in which he participated during the Second World War. He commanded a motorcycle company, a reconnaissance battalion, a grenadier regiment and an SS Panzer division. The combat units of the Armored Meyer, as he was nicknamed by the troops, were participants in heated battles, the invasion of Poland, France, the occupation of the Balkans and Greece, participants in fierce battles on the Eastern Front and the campaign in Normandy, where the division was almost destroyed. Do not forget to rate the video, as well as leave your opinion about this material. Well, we're starting. The Polish campaign. We all stood and waited for this moment. Our eyes, which were already starting to ripple, were glued to the hands of the clock. At dawn, the engines of the cars roared. We increased our speed, went faster and faster, all the way to the border. I listened intently to the silence of the morning twilight. At any moment, clearing our way to the east, the first shells of our artillery were to begin their deadly flight. And suddenly hissing, howling and shrill screeching hung over us, creating the impression of even greater our own speed, which we felt with every nerve. Approaching the border, we took a cursory glance at our assault groups, while they were rapidly moving towards the border fences and destroying obstacles with high explosive charges. Machine gun fire swept down the street, and short blinding flashes of exploding grenades illuminated the targets. Our tanks and armored vehicles broke into the village of Gola at full speed. Infantry assault detachments captured the bridge over the Prasna River. It was already prepared for demolition and fell into our hands unharmed. In a matter of minutes, the village was occupied. Polish soldiers were getting out of their positions, dumbfounded and stunned, walking towards us with their hands raised. They still did not fully believe that just 10 minutes after the start of hostilities, the war was over for them. I stopped in front of the body of a Polish officer. The bullet pierced his throat. Warm blood gushed from the wound. Yes, it was a war. This is the first death I have seen in this war, clearly imprinted in my mind its grim reality. But it was necessary to move on. Uprooted trees and burned-out houses made it difficult to move. We could barely make out the road. The fog rising from the ground mixed with smoke from the explosions of shells and bombs. I couldn't stay with the regimental headquarters. After passing the goal, I moved forward with a reconnaissance patrol. Of course, as the commander of an SS tank destroyer company, I had completely different responsibilities. The attack of enemy tanks was not expected, and besides, my company was divided into parts between separate battalions of our regiment. I was not satisfied with the nature of the fighting, so I secretly followed the advancing tanks. Since 1934, I have watched the development of tanks as weapons in the exercises at Debrecen, and later at Zossen. Now I found myself in the war as a tank destroyer. The swirling dust and fog were still hanging in the air when I saw two of our tanks and a motorcycle platoon. Visibility was less than 300 meters. Suddenly, the ominous silence was interrupted by the impact of a Polish anti-tank cannon shell. The first tank spun and, covered in smoke, stood up. His rollers were still spinning when the second tank was also hit. Both of our tanks were at a distance of about 150 meters from the anti-tank gun, the position of which was well camouflaged. Shell after shell pierced the armor of our tanks, and machine gun bursts poured down the street, forcing us to seek shelter. We heard the cries of the crew of the reconnaissance tank and were forced only to watch, unable to come to the rescue. Every time a new shell penetrated the armor and penetrated inside the tank, the screams of our mortally wounded tank men who remained inside became louder. We tried to help our comrades who managed to leave the damaged tanks and get out of the shelling, but it was impossible. Enemy machine guns were hitting the street. Their fire moved after the tankers, who managed to get out of their broken and burning cars. The screams of those who remained in the damaged tanks became weaker. I was lying behind a pile of gravel. As if mesmerized, he looked at the blood oozing from the holes in the armor of the first tank. It was as if I was paralyzed. I didn't see those Polish soldiers who were shooting, but my comrades were already lying dead, right in front of me. Polish cavalry galloped out of the fog. She was rushing straight at us, and she was not stopped by the fire of my Mr. Machine Gun 38. Only when the fire of a motorcycle platoon mowed down several horses and riders, a furious cavalry detachment galloped back into the fog. Our artillery was processing the height in front of us, while a grenadier tank battalion was storming enemy positions. The young grenadiers moved as if they were on exercises. They could not be stopped either by machine gun or artillery fire. Countless, as it seemed, many soldiers were supported by tanks on the offensive against the enemy. I watched, amazed, as the attack passed right in front of me. Tanks were rushing forward rapidly. As the attack escalated, the Poles were swept away from their positions. The offensive continued with almost no resistance, neither the enemy nor natural obstacles could stop it. Each of the advancing German soldiers was convinced of the justice of this war and, without hesitation, gave his life for the rights of his people. For these young soldiers, the war with Poland was not aggression, but the elimination of injustice. They wanted to eliminate the shameful legacy of Versailles, to return the territories lost in 1919 and to stop the oppression of the Germans, who became a people divided by borders. The German soldiers drew their strength from their aspirations. These young people were the elite of the nation. They were selected from thousands of volunteers, and they underwent intensive training for 4 years. The SS regiment, since August, 1940th year, a brigade, and since June, 1941, already a division, Leibstandard Adolf Hitler was recruited from soldiers who were 19 years old by the beginning of the war. Non-commissioned officers were about 25 years old. It is obvious that these young people had no influence on the political events of 1933. In 1933, they were still schoolchildren who aspired to some ideals and wanted to devote themselves to the service of these ideals. At about 10 o'clock in the morning, the town of Bolesławiec surrendered after a fierce assault and street fighting. Enemy artillery fire rained down on this settlement, causing casualties among the population. By nightfall, we were already near Warszawę and were preparing an attack the next morning. The motorized SS regiment, Leibstandard Adolf Hitler, was attached to the 17th Infantry Division and was supposed to cover its right flank from possible attacks by the Polish Cavalry Brigade. The impending darkness hid the destruction caused by the day. The terrible picture of the battlefield was visible only up close. The glow of burning villages rose on the horizon, thick smoke crept over the desecrated land. We sat silently behind a dilapidated wall, trying to comprehend the first day of fighting, and listened to excerpts from Hitler's historical speech. I decided to resolve the issue with Danzig and the Polish corridor and find a way to make sure that the change in relations between Germany and Poland will make peaceful coexistence between us possible. The Führer's words echoed in our ears for a long time. Our regiment again joined the battle across the Warta River as part of the 17th Infantry Division and advanced towards Pabianice near Lodz. On the 7th of September, at about 10 o'clock in the morning, we reached the outskirts of Pabianice and received orders to take up defense to the south along the hills stretching through Rzgałała, Rakowa and Lodz. Significant enemy forces with anti-tank weapons occupied Pabianice. The attack of the 1st Battalion of the 23rd Tank Regiment had just been repulsed by the Poles holding the defense. Our damaged and broken tanks remained on the battlefield. They were disabled by Polish anti-tank guns. The motorized regiment, Leibstandard Adolf Hitler, continued its combat mission and immediately began the assault. The 1st and 2nd companies broke into the city, followed by other units. This fierce attack forced the Poles to retreat to the center of the city, but then powerful enemy counterattacks followed against the flanks of the regiment. The 2nd Battalion of the 46th Artillery Regiment held its firing positions with all its might, repelling persistent counterattacks of the Polish infantry. The Polish units went ahead, regardless of losses. The command post of the regiment suddenly became the site of the main strike. All clerks and drivers also had to fight. The Poles reached the command post through a potato field, and since the tops provided excellent camouflage and hid the attackers, we could not see them until they were within grenade throw distance. It seemed impossible to stop the enemy coming closer and closer. Then I jumped to my feet and from a standing position began to shoot at the potato field. It was the only way to get into the creeping Poles. To my right, a grenadier from the 13th Company fired at them as if he were on a shooting range, cue after cue. Our target shooting didn't last long. Suddenly I found myself back at the bottom of the trench, thrown there by a bullet that grazed my shoulder. My neighbor was killed after being shot in the neck. Never again will I try to stop an attack from a standing position. The attacks continued with the tenacity shown on both sides, and only in the late afternoon came the moment when the Poles were broken. They surrendered by the hundreds and went on a long journey prepared for prisoners of war. Meanwhile, the 16th Tank Corps approached Warsaw and engaged in a battle with Polish units and formations defending the city, as well as with the remnants of Polish troops breaking through in the eastern direction. The commander of the Tank Corps, General Gepner, welcomed the advanced units of our regiment in Nadarzen. We were attached to the 4th Tank Division of this corps. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler was ordered to hold the Alterzew, Dominev line and not to let the Polish units coming out of the encirclement break through from the west to Warsaw. While on the march, the 1st Battalion of the motorized SS Regiment, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, was ordered to change direction and move north to Alterzew. Motorized infantry followed the detachments of tanks and armored vehicles. Columns of our troops disappeared into the night. General Gopner did not doubt the outcome of the war in Poland, but foresaw heavy fighting for his 16th Tank Corps. He believed that the Polish troops, still fighting in the encirclement to the west of Warsaw, would make every effort to break through to the capital through our positions. After a few kilometers, it became obvious that the coming night would bring with it a hard fight. We had to fight our way through the suburbs of Warsaw. From Alterzew came the loud noise of the battle. The 1st Battalion reached the main line of deployment and fought with significant enemy forces. On the road, the retreating Polish columns closed with each other and a complete jam was formed. During the night they were completely destroyed. Hundreds of dead lay among the rubble. The whole road was littered with broken artillery pieces, other weapons, abandoned ammunition. The merciless battle continued until morning, and both sides were waiting for dawn to come to sort out the situation. When dawn broke, the full horror of what had happened became visible. Not only a lot of Polish soldiers were killed on and near the road. Columns of refugees mixed with the troops were also shot by our fire. Dead and wounded horses hung in their harness by the wrecked wagons. Crying children grabbed their dead mothers or the mothers of their dead children. The wounded crawled out of the wreckage and called for help. The field dressing station soon overflowed. Poles and Germans helped the victims together. Not a single shot was heard. The war was suspended. The refugees were unlucky, they retreated from Poznan and joined the military columns, which, as it seemed to them, provided them with protection, and got into a meat grinder. This night for the first time truly revealed to us the true face of the war. There was no longer any difference between a soldier and a civilian. Modern weapons destroyed both of them. I didn't see a single German soldier laughing on the road of death at Alterzew. Terror touched them all. The September sun shone brightly on the blood-soaked road. More than 1,000 Polish prisoners were ordered to remove the rubble. 600 people were sent to the enemy's positions with a proposal to capitulate. A single anti-tank gun destroyed the enemy's armored train. Exploding ammunition flew into the air with a terrible roar and completely destroyed the train. In the next 2 days, powerful enemy attacks hit the positions held by the 2nd Battalion of the 33rd Infantry Regiment, the 2nd Battalion of the 35th Tank Regiment and our regiment. But the Polish attacks were useless. In vain I asked the commander to allow me to expand the scope of my duties and take a more active part in the battle. I had to be content with commanding a company that is scattered throughout our regiment in platoons. I reminded the commander at every opportunity that I was a tank driver and a motorcyclist, and I felt absolutely unnecessary in the place I was currently occupying. But it's no use, at the moment I remained a tank destroyer. During the night from the 12th to the 13th of September, a strong part of the enemy broke through the positions of the 2nd Battalion of our regiment. A total breakthrough seemed inevitable. Early in the morning we received a report that the 6th Company of the Leibstandarte was crushed, and the company commander was killed. He has always been close to me, we have served in the same regiment since 1929. However, we found it incredible what was reported in the report about the imminent breakthrough. We simply did not believe that the enemy could break through our defensive positions. Having received an order to find out if what the message says is true, I jumped into the driver's seat of a motorcycle with a sidecar. SS Obersturmführer Pfeiffer went with me, and we drove in the direction of Blone. Pfeiffer died a few years later, commanding a tank company. After leaving, we quickly rushed along the road of death, in order to get rid of annoying flies as soon as possible. Besides, the corpses of the horses stank terribly. A few hundred meters from Świecice I saw 2 Polish soldiers and a soldier of the 6th Company of the Leibstandard, who were behind a small bridge. The behavior of all 3 soldiers seemed so strange to me that I braked sharply, jumped off the motorcycle and walked towards this group standing in the trench. It was only when I had already approached the edge of the trench that I realized the reason for the strange behavior of the German soldier. He was captured by these Polish soldiers and looked at me in amazement when I walked alone to them. Damn it, I'm damn lucky again. Only the Mr. Machine. 38 Pfeiffer did not let the Poles send me to the next world. Indeed, our 6th Company was attacked and defeated. The company commander lay dead in a trench a few hundred meters away. Pfeiffer and I proceeded further to the Candle and soon found our fallen comrade. His chest was pierced by bullets. Seppel Lang died like a real soldier. We will never forget him. The enemy units that pushed us were destroyed during the day. The front line was restored. The motorized SS Regiment, Leibstandard, Adolf Hitler, and the 4th Panzer Division of the 16th Panzer Corps of Gepner were involved in the battle on the Bzura in order to prevent the scattered units and formations of the Polish army breaking out of the encirclement from crossing the river. The Poles attacked with great tenacity and proved once again that they know how to die. It would be unfair to deny them courage. The battle on Bzura was desperate and fierce. The blood of the best of the Poles mixed with the waters of the river. The losses of the Poles were terrible. All their attempts to break through were repelled by our artillery fire from prepared positions. The resistance of the Poles here was finally broken on the 18th of September, after which we were ordered to attack the fortress in Modlin. Heavy fighting with Polish troops trying to break through to Warsaw began in a wooded area south of Modlin. The 1st Battalion of the Leibstandard was attacked and surrounded by superior enemy forces. On September 19, at 7 o'clock in the morning, Lieutenant General Reinhardt ordered an attack to rescue our 1st Battalion, as well as to break through to the Vistula River. The attack was supported by the 2nd Battalion of the 35th Tank Regiment. The viscous sandy roads made it very difficult to move, and wheeled vehicles could only move very slowly. A fierce battle ensued again, and although the situation of the Poles was hopeless, they did not think of giving up. They fought to the last cartridge. During the attack, we found the remains of an SS Obersturmführer Bruchmann and 1 SS Unterführer of the 1st Battalion of the Leibstandard. Both of them were captured wounded and severely disfigured. Bruchmann was a platoon commander in my company and got married just 2 weeks before the start of the war. The battle for the old fortress of Modlin began with artillery preparation and attacks by dive bombers. It was the first time we had encountered the destructive impact of our dive bombers and could not understand how the Polish garrison of this old Russian fortress could withstand such a barrage of fire for so long. Contrary to our expectations, the Polish units in Modlin offered stubborn resistance and repelled all attacks. The fortress fell only at the very end of the campaign. Infantry divisions replaced our tank and motorized formations around Modlin. And the released mobile forces were prepared for a decisive offensive on Warsaw, which began with the bombing and concentration of artillery fire and airstrikes on fortifications and main strongholds. The main bombardment of the city began only on the evening of the 26th of September, and on the outer forts of the city and its supply bases was carried out a day earlier. The Poles were not going to surrender yet. There were still 120,000 Polish soldiers left to defend the capital, not counting the militia. The Poles agreed to surrender the city only on the afternoon of September 27. Then almost all the fighting at the front stopped. The campaign in Poland was almost over, but the Modlin garrison fought until the 30th of September, and the garrison on the Hel Peninsula fought until the 2nd of October. On September 28, the commander of the 8th German Army, General Blaskowitz, signed the surrender. We listened with amazement to the generous terms offered to the Poles. The officers were left with their swords, and non-commissioned officers and soldiers were made prisoners of war only for a short time. Very soon, on the 1st of October, the motorized SS regiment, Leibstandard Adolf Hitler, like many other units and formations, was ordered to move west. We were all sure that we would march to the banks of the Rhine, but we were mistaken. On the 4th of October we reached Prague, where we were allowed to stay for 2 weeks. The regiment was greeted with great delight by the German population of the city. Thousands of people greeted us joyfully when we appeared on Wenceslas Square. Constantine von Neurath, the venerable imperial governor of the German Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, delivered a eulogy in our honor. I again reported to the regimental commander in Prague about my urgent request to be seconded to other duties. My experience in Poland did not bring me satisfaction, and I was afraid that I would remain the commander of an SS tank destroyer company in the regiment for the rest of the war. At the end of October, I took command of an SS motorcycle company. This meant that I would be in the vanguard of the regiment. And although I have long desired this appointment, I was sorry to part with the SS company of tank destroyers. I formed my company in 1936 and became attached to it. But it was still nice to realize that I was allowed to take a platoon commander and several SS Unterführers with me. In addition, my faithful chauffeur was also allowed to serve with me in the 15th Company of the Leibstandard Adolf Hitler. I was finally in my element. We trained hard every day. The motorcyclists did it with enthusiasm, and I found their full support. My slogan, "The motor is our best weapon," was fully supported by my soldiers. In just a few weeks, I had gained the trust of my new company and knew that I could rely on every single soldier. We were looking forward with interest to further developments on the Western Front. The Blitzkrieg in Poland gave the soldiers hope that politicians would be able to end this ill-fated war and another military campaign against the Western Allied coalition might be avoided. Our illusory hope was soon dashed when we learned that the Allies categorically rejected Adolf Hitler's peace proposals at the beginning of October. After that, it became obvious to our soldiers that the war could only be completed with fire and sword. The question of how victory in the war over the Western Allies can be achieved has captured the minds of young grenadiers as much as the minds of the most experienced military commanders. Everyone agreed that defense alone could not achieve the desired result for the country. And the point of view of the commanders and soldiers were united. If political understanding is impossible, then only a general offensive will give the results and peace we all need. In November, our unit moved to the Koblenz area and found itself under the command of General Guderian. We used the experience gained in the Polish campaign and trained soldiers to perform new tasks. Making plans, exercises continuously followed one after another. The enthusiasm of the soldiers I commanded inspired me again. Neither the hardships of the exercises nor the winter cold cooled the zeal of the young soldiers. Combat training continued under the slogan, "Sweat saves blood." It is better to dig a 10-meter trench than a 1-meter grave. My company was stationed in empty houses in Bad Ems, located on the banks of the Lahn River. The rugged terrain there was very suitable for our combat training, as we knew that our offensive with Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps would pass through the wooded Ardennes and we would face problems on the terrain similar to those offered to us by the Westerwald, where we were based. Like the Ardennes, this is part of the Rhine Slate Mountains. Guderian inspected each company. His planning exercises were particularly interesting to us. All his remarks served us as an excellent guide. He said that, "The engine of a tank is your weapon, as much as its cannon." Under the command of this extremely experienced commander, we were preparing ourselves for the inevitable offensive to the west. On the 24th of December, 1939, Adolf Hitler visited us in Bad Ems. He talked to the regiment and told us what hopes he had for us. He hinted that soon we will have to walk through the battlefields, sprinkled with the blood of our fathers, in the struggle for lasting peace and a strong Europe. In February, 1940, we were transferred to von Bock's Army Group B and moved north. The unexpected dispatch was a complete surprise. We would have preferred to stay with Guderian. With the transfer, a new stage in our preparation began. We were attached to the 227th Infantry Division. We, as a motorized unit, were ordered to cross the border of Holland with the beginning of hostilities, break through the border outposts and reach the IJssel River. The execution of this order required the movement of troops at full speed, in order to quickly capture the numerous bridges over the canals, and above all over the IJssel River. We were constantly training in forcing rivers and channels. Soon we worked out all possible situations during the battle and were confident that we would cope with the task set before us. My unit was stationed in Salzburgen, and I stayed at the priest's house. It was there on May 1st that I met the famous Bishop Count von Galen, who in a few years will fight for the revision of the death sentence imposed on me and will draw the attention of judges to the fact that justice should be based on Christian principles. Count von Galen insisted that my company receive his blessing. With the advent of the favorable season, the day when we had to start fighting was inevitably approaching. Day after day we waited for the code word. On the 9th of May, 1900th year, the code was transmitted and operational readiness was introduced. At 2 o'clock in the morning on the 10th of May, the following code was given: Danzig. This was the final order to attack the Dutch border fortifications. We left Salzburgen in the dead of night and moved quietly in the dark. On both sides of the road there were people waving goodbye to us. They wished us good luck and a speedy return alive and well. The final preparations for the attack were completed at 4 o'clock on the morning of the 10th of May. I gathered my young motorcyclists again to remind them of the basic principles of action in combat conditions. When dawn broke on that fateful day on May 10th, I promised my soldiers that every officer of our combat group would always be on the firing line, thus confirming the principles of leadership we had adopted. In the presence of my soldiers, I shook hands with all my officers to emphasize my promise. The attack began at exactly 5 o'clock in the morning. Our assault squad ambushed an outpost near De Poppy and captured the Dutch, who were shocked by the suddenness of the attack. The bridge over the Vecht River was captured by us intact. The assault squad cut the wires of explosive devices. Over our head, countless U-52 transport planes were flying in a westerly direction. These were our comrades from the 22nd Airborne Division and other units flying to the landing sites. German warplanes, like hawks, whistled through the air and swooped on pre-planned targets. It was as if a fever had seized us. As soon as the border barrier was removed, the bridge behind it was immediately secured, and then we raced along the smooth asphalt road like drivers of racing cars. Max Wunschie, the commander of the 1st platoon, raced ahead of his soldiers and carried them forward with his enthusiasm. I followed the Wunsch platoon and was surprised that we did not meet any resistance. Our advance towards Oldenzaal and Hengelo continued at full speed. Concrete tank barriers and bridge fences were not protected. Some bridges were slightly damaged by the explosions, but we could drive over them. Born was entered without a single shot being fired. The inhabitants of Holland stood by the road and watched the rapid advance of our troops. Enemy sappers blew up the bridge over the canal beyond the Born. But we broke this first resistance of the enemy and forced the channel in a matter of minutes. The doors and walls of neighboring barns were used to build bridges. Speed was the most important thing right now. All the motorcyclists were sent forward to pursue the enemy demolition teams and prevent them from destroying the next bridge. SS Obersturmführer Kraus, the commander of the 2nd platoon, undertook to pursue the teams of enemy engineering troops. Meanwhile, the temporary bridge being built has become strong enough to allow motorcycles with a sidecar to cross. 37mm anti-tank guns were attached to the motorcycles. The swift pursuit continued. Unfortunately, tanks and armored vehicles have temporarily lagged behind. They ensured the safety of the engineering troops, who quickly built a new bridge over the canal. Unfortunately, we could not prevent the Dutch demolition team from causing damage to other bridges. These bridges, previously mined, were blown up. But these explosions could no longer seriously hinder our progress. We reached the town of Zwolle without much delay. At about 11 o'clock in the morning, the vanguard was already on the outskirts of Zwolle, which meant penetrating 80 kilometers into the enemy's territory. The advanced platoon, under the command of Res, moved to the railway embankment to the south of the city, and then, behind the embankment, decided to advance further on foot. What a surprise awaited our soldiers in the next minute. The wonderful chestnut trees on both sides of the road were cut down to block the entrance to the city. But what is the use of the best obstacles if they are not guarded by soldiers ready for battle? To the north of the barricade, just a few hundred meters away, we saw a machine gun and long-term firing points, as well as anti-tank barriers. What is most surprising is that their defenders calmly and nonchalantly sat on top of these fortifications and had breakfast. They were enjoying the May sun, having left their combat posts in gloomy casemates and bunkers. 3 barricades prevented us from breaking right through the line of long-term fortifications and catching the Dutch by surprise. However, the fire opened by us according to the calculations of the pillboxes, who relaxed and missed our appearance, allowed our soldiers to quickly overcome the space shot from the pillboxes without losses. Before the Dutch had time to understand what was happening, our motorcyclists reached the pillboxes and disarmed their would-be defenders. However, it took a lot of effort to remove the trees. Our approaching tanks began to pull apart giant trees. The dismantling of the barricades took too much time, which I didn't like at all. It was impossible to let the enemy come to his senses. We had to take advantage of the surprise factor. Without a moment's hesitation, I jumped into the Dutch car and raced to Zwolle together with SS Obersturmführer Wunschie and an SS Grenadier. SS Obercharführer Erich accompanied us on a Dutch motorcycle. I intended to take the commandant of the city by surprise and force him to agree to a ceasefire. The Dutch soldiers stood rooted to the spot in the street when we shouted at them and pointed to the barricade of trees where they were told to be. They dropped their weapons and headed where indicated. The further we went into the city, the more restless I felt in connection with this excursion. I wanted to turn back, but it was already too late and I had to continue this game to the end. The sound of firing at the pillboxes was not heard in the city center. Dutch families, enjoying a beautiful May day, scattered like frightened chickens under the shadow of a hawk hanging over them. Despite the extremely awkward situation, we couldn't help but laugh at the reaction of the Dutch. The solid building of a civil institution in the center of the city and the sight of people entering and leaving it in uniform led us to try our luck there. We drove right into the middle of the crowd, braking sharply at the last moment. The car seemed about to turn over. In a split second, all our weapons were aimed at the astonished people in uniform. The Dutch stopped dead in their tracks. A respectable gentleman in civilian clothes introduced himself to us as a representative of the Queen, and said that he would instruct the Dutch troops in Zwolle to stop resisting. He kept his promise. There were no more shots fired in Zwolle. With several captured Dutch officers, we hurried back to the blockage of trees. Zwolle was ours, but, unfortunately, we could not prevent the destruction of major bridges over the IJssel. Both bridges were blown up in the early morning. I almost had a stroke when I drove up to the dismantled fence. My soldiers and several young Dutchmen were having fun riding on the carousel, almost without thinking about caution. Meanwhile, the 3rd Battalion of our SS regiment, Leibstandard Adolf Hitler, crossed the IJssel River 800 meters south of the destroyed railway bridge at Zutphen. SS men under the command of SS Sturmbannführer Trabant attacked Hohn. The village was taken at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Our losses were insignificant. The mission of the regimental combat team was completed. We came to the IJssel River and partially crossed it. At the same time, in my strike group, the only victim was one soldier who was wounded. A motorcycle shooter Fleischer was shot in the leg at a blockage of trees. During the night, our regiment was withdrawn from the 227th Infantry Division and placed under the operational control of the headquarters of the 18th Army. The commander of the 227th Infantry Division, Major General Zickwolf, appreciated the rapid and successful offensive of the regiment. As the first officer who distinguished himself so much in this campaign, SS Obersturmführer Kraus received the Iron Cross of the First Class from the hands of the general. Kraus and his reinforced platoon advanced about 60 kilometers beyond IJssel and captured 7 officers and 120 soldiers. The attack on Rotterdam and The Hague. After the fighting at the turn of the IJssel River, the regiment was ordered to advance to Geertruidenberg and establish contact with the 9th Panzer Division. After some skirmishes with the Dutch infantry, we reached our destination in the late afternoon of the 13th of May. Contact with the 9th Panzer Division was established. The next morning at 4 o'clock in the morning we began to move forward, crossing the bridge over the Meuse. Thanks to the actions of the parachutists, the bridge was in our hands intact. Paratroopers were scattered over a large meadow on both sides of the bridge embankment during the landing. Many of the brave paratroopers were killed on the approaches to the long-term firing points protecting the bridge, but the surprise factor worked here too. The enemy did not have the opportunity to destroy this extremely important bridge. The way to South Holland and the coast was open. The 9th Panzer Division advanced to the port of Rotterdam and made contact with the 11th Company of the 16th Airborne Regiment. The company was thrown out near strategic bridges from gliders, captured these bridges and protected them from continuous attacks by the Dutch until the approach of our tanks. The task of the regiment was as follows. The reinforced motorized SS Regiment Leibstandard Adolf Hitler, in cooperation with the 9th Panzer Division, will pass through or past Rotterdam and then continue the offensive towards The Hague. The regiment was preparing to attack south of Katendrecht. Preparations were completed by 1 o'clock. Rotterdam was to be attacked at 2 o'clock in the afternoon after artillery preparation and bombing by U-87 dive bombers and bombarders. My vanguard moved forward to the port of Rotterdam and stopped near a large Dutch liner. The ship has been burning since the 10th of May. His cargo consisted of American cars. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon there was a rumor that the Dutch were negotiating a surrender. The negotiators were General Student, Lieutenant Colonel von Holitz of the 22nd Airborne Division and Dutch Colonel Sharrow. During the negotiations, General Student was shot in the head, and he was taken away in a serious condition. It was necessary to confirm whether the Dutch High Command accepted our terms of surrender. I was with a group of officers on the bridge when several groups of E-111 bombers approached Rotterdam. Dutch anti-aircraft guns opened fire on German planes. The truce was broken. We tried in vain to attract the attention of our pilots by launching red rockets in order to stop the bombing. We were standing in the middle of the target area of the air attack and believed until the last moment that we could prevent it, but, as we later learned, the pilots did not see our flares because of the fog. Thick clouds of smoke from the ship burning at the pier created a smoke screen over the city. When we heard the whistle of falling bombs, we cleared the bridge and hurried to the nearest basements. That's how it turned out. The bombing could no longer be stopped. Rotterdam has become a sea of fire. The last bomb fell at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We looked at the burning city and for the first time experienced the horror of an air raid. The fire was rising everywhere like a wall. It was almost impossible to move through the streets. Our doubts about the negotiations on the streets of the burning city were dispelled by the order for an urgent departure. My vanguard was to contact the units of the 22nd Airborne Division in Oversea. We approached the maze of cluttered streets and searched for the way to the Oversea, going deeper and deeper into the burning Rotterdam, covering our faces. People fled from this hell to the port area. My motorcyclists were moving through narrow streets that seemed to be at the mercy of the devil. The shop windows around US were shattering with a crash. Burning clothed mannequins and ornaments on them created an unearthly picture. Then we moved along the deserted streets of the city. Not a single Dutchman was in sight, they were all driven out by the unbearable heat of the fires. Heavy armored vehicles moved through a dense curtain of smoke, and sometimes only the rear lights of a tank driving ahead or an armored car following it showed the way. There could be no mistake, because it was impossible to stop, the heat became unbearable. After we passed the shopping district and reached the alley, I ordered a short stop to give the motorcyclists an opportunity to catch up with us. Covered with soot, with singed hair, but smiling faces, the motorcyclists of the last squad left the burning city. Behind us, everything was already blocked by a dense wall of fire. We couldn't turn back, so go ahead. We advanced cautiously towards Oversea under the protection of the canal causeway and were met by Dutch infantry fire. The drawbridge across the canal was raised. However, we quickly blew up the drive mechanism, a heavy car drove onto the bridge, and it slowly descended. In front of us stretched the road to the northwest. But what did this straight segment of the path look like? Our planes landed one by one on this wide concrete road. There were already completely disabled, crashed, or burned out planes on it. These were transport planes of the 22nd Airborne Division, which used this road as a runway when they could not use the airfields intended for them. They became the target of Dutch artillery. Airborne troops steadfastly repelled all enemy attacks for 3 days. A particularly fierce battle ensued in Oversea. We continued to move forward on both sides of the road. The machine gun and rifle fire of the Dutch could not stop us. We searched in vain for the survivors of the 22nd Airborne Division, but apart from the traces of the battle and the bodies of dead comrades, we could not find a single German soldier. Only when we moved further in the direction of Delft, about 10 soldiers and a lieutenant ran out to us. A young officer hugged me in exhaustion. Around 9 o'clock in the evening we reached Delft and made contact with the surviving units of the encircled 22nd Airborne Division. Our regiment took 3,536 Dutch prisoners on the 14th of May. The disarmament of the Dutch troops in The Hague was completed on the 15th of May without enemy resistance. The regiment captured 160 officers and 7,000 soldiers. With the seizure of the War Ministry, the war in Holland ended for us. The invasion of France. The regiment entered northern France. Having previously passed Belgian Namur, near the Franco-Belgian border, near Valenciennes, he first clashed with French troops. The task of the regiment was to prevent a breakthrough to the south of the French cut-off in Belgium and northern France. All attempts of the enemy to do this were suppressed by our fire from quickly prepared defensive positions. The regiment then occupied as many as 30 kilometers along the front. This is a lot. Not far from the old fortress of Le Quesnoy, which is 20 kilometers southwest of Valenciennes, a field from which the harvest had just been harvested made me feel unreal. A few hours before, thousands of Frenchmen were supposed to be camped here. Now there was not a single French soldier in sight. But countless French helmets lay on a huge field, as if lined up for a parade. The neatly placed helmets, it seemed to me, expressed the helplessness and weakness of the French army. It was an army without morale and self-confidence. There were no soldiers in it who had survived the Battle of Verdun. This army fought without faith in its just cause and, unlike us, had no clear goals. The battles of the First World War were still fresh in the memory of French soldiers. They believed in the impregnability of their Maginot Line and, consequently, in the invincibility of the defenders of this world's greatest fortification. France had not only the Maginot Line, it also had the greatest tank power. The armed forces of the Allied coalition had more than 4,000 tanks at their disposal. This armored vehicle opposed 2,500 tanks of the Germans at the beginning of their offensive. The reason for the rapid defeat of the French was, of course, their outdated management principles and the dispersion of armored forces. On the 24th of May, the motorized SS regiment Leibstandard Adolf Hitler was transferred to the operational subordination of Panzer Group von Kleist and attached to the 1st Panzer Division. A few days earlier, von Kleist's rapidly advancing Panzer Group had reached the rugged battlefields of the Somme during the First World War. Having crossed the canals and passed Cambrai, Péronne, Amiens and Abbeville, Kleist was ready to take Boulogne. On the 24th of May, the 1st Panzer Division reached the river at the Withers and was ordered to advance on Dunkirk. As part of this operation, our regiment attacked Watten. During the night march, I advanced with my vanguard up the river and further to Watten Hill, whose 72-meter height allowed me to dominate the surrounding terrain, a swampy lowland. This hill strengthened the enemy's defenses on the opposite bank of the river, the bridges over which were destroyed, and the British and French troops occupied prepared positions. Under these conditions, the hill could only be captured by a well-thought-out and unexpected attack. That night, the 3rd Battalion of the Leibstandard Adolf Hitler prepared to attack. Shortly before it began, crossing the river was unexpectedly banned by Hitler's order. The elimination of the enemy's Dunkirk bridgehead was entrusted to the Luftwaffe. All offensive operations of Panzer Group von Kleist were immediately stopped. We were simply shocked by this order, since we were in an open space on the west bank of the river, and breathed a sigh of relief when we heard about Sepp Dietrich's decision to break through with a fight, despite Hitler's order. After effective fire training, the 10th Company of the Leibstandard Adolf Hitler managed to cross the river and reach the outskirts of Watten on the east bank of the river. The stubborn resistance of the British and French prevented the advance of the crossed units. Only thanks to the attack of the 3rd Battalion of the Leibstandard, the height was in our hands. The hill, framed by the ruins of an ancient castle, gave us an excellent view to the east. We were standing on the ruins when the general commanding the 14th Tank Corps suddenly appeared and demanded an explanation from Sepp Dietrich why he was advancing despite the ban. Sepp Dietrich replied, "The area to the west of the river was perfectly viewed from the Watten Hill. This height stood across everyone's throat. That's why we decided to master it." General Guderian approved Sepp Dietrich's decision. A few moments after this conversation, we were all lying in the mud and had to crawl for our lives, looking for shelter under enemy machine gun fire. The agility with which the veteran tank men Dietrich and Guderian disappeared, hiding in the ruins, was amazing. As a result, Guderian ordered to continue the offensive even further, in the direction of Worms, Berg. At the time of this attack, our regiment was attached to the 20th Infantry Division. The 76th Infantry Regiment attacked on our right. The reinforced infantry regiment, Great Germany, was next to us on the left. The beginning of the offensive on May 27 was postponed because the building of bridges across the canal was not completed in time. At 8 in the morning, an enemy attack followed from a small forest area 2 kilometers east of Watten Hill, which was repelled by our artillery. At 9 o'clock in the morning our regiment went on the attack and quickly advanced. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the regimental command post was shelled by enemy heavy artillery, which lasted until noon. In Bolzel, the 1st Battalion of the Leibstandard met strong resistance and, in addition, was subjected to intense shelling from the flank in the area of the offensive of the Infantry Regiment, Great Germany, which was trailing behind and only after a while was able to secure the flank of our offensive. The motorcycle shooters were ready, waiting for the result of the attack. After the capture of Bolzel, my vanguard was planned to be released like an arrow from a tightly stretched bow and, catching the British by surprise, capture Worms. I couldn't waste any more time and tried to assess the situation with my own eyes after the attack of the 1st Battalion of the Leibstandard Adolf Hitler. A motorcycle without a sidecar seemed to me a suitable horse for this purpose. The shelling at the intersection of roads forced me to drive along the road at full speed. Broken telephone wires lay on the road, turning the ride into an obstacle race. Suddenly I felt a jolt and, separating from the motorcycle, like a rocket, flew in the direction of the tree. From that moment on, I didn't remember anything. Apparently, someone picked me up and took me to the regimental command post. Sepp Dietrich's not particularly friendly voice brought me back to reality. In accordance with his orders, I was immediately put on a stretcher and received a doctor's order not to get up in any case, because I was shell-shocked from the blow. Some time later, being still a bedridden patient, I found out that our unit had started moving, and I saw my motorcyclists driving in the direction of Bolzel. The dull rumble of motorcycle engines was like music to my ears. My encounter with the tree was in the past. I had to lead my soldiers. Unnoticed by anyone, I jumped off the stretcher onto the road and jumped on the courier's motorcycle, and then quickly passed the advanced units of the company. The commander of the vanguard group, Wunshi, greeted me with a questioning look, but he did not have the opportunity to ask questions. Roaring engine, I rolled to the front platoon and followed in the direction of Bolzel. My soldiers followed me. They had no idea that I had just got up from the stretcher. We were met by rifle and machine gun fire from the outskirts of Bolzel. We also came under mortar fire. Mines were exploding on both sides of the road. It was not recommended to stop in such a situation. So we rushed to the entrance to the town at full speed. The motorcycles seemed to be flying over the cobblestones of the road. I knew that it only took a few seconds to get past the danger zone, and that my soldiers were following me without hesitation. To the left of the road I saw a machine gun nest. My motorcyclists were already out of his firing zone. At full speed we raced past the first houses of the town. Around a bend in the road, we saw the French hastily erecting a barrier of agricultural machinery. Without firing a single shot, Eric's group managed to disarm the builders of the barricade. Behind us, motorcycle gunmen fired at the gardens on the left and forced the shocked defenders of the city to cease fire and gather in the street. 15 enemy officers and 250 enlisted and non-commissioned officers went on the road to be captured. We had to report 2 victims. During the approach, SS Unterscharführer Peters was killed, and SS Oberscharführer Erich was shot in the thigh. Our bold strike was successful, but I had to hand over command of my vanguard to an assistant for a couple of days and obey the doctor's orders. On the 28th of May, the regiment, the 2nd Tank Brigade and the 11th Rifle Brigade launched an offensive against Worms. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the tanks began to move along with the grenadiers. The enemy tried to stop our tanks with their heavy artillery fire. The enemy had the upper hand in artillery. He also had numerous infantry units here. Just at the site of the 2nd Battalion of the Leibstandard, 2 enemy regiments were discovered. I was at the command post of our regiment, and I was not allowed to leave it without permission. My motorcycle shooters were waiting for the development of events in Worms. They were supposed to be connected to the operation after the town was taken. The encirclement ring around Dunkirk was shrinking more and more. Sepp Dietrich and Max Wunshi went to the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the Leibstandard to get a clear idea of the current situation. At 12 o'clock in the afternoon, a messenger returned with the bad news that they were cut off on the eastern outskirts of Eskelberg. The 2nd Company of the Leibstandard tried to rescue its commander from a critical situation, but they were prevented by intense machine gun and artillery fire from the enemy. The attack of the 15th Company of the Leibstandard was also repulsed by the fire of the defending British. The reinforced platoon of the 6th Company of the 2nd Tank Brigade under the command of Lieutenant Corder lost 4 tanks and could not overcome the open space. Lieutenant Corder and Sergeant Krommel were killed a couple of hundred meters from Eskelberg. Sepp Dietrich, who was surrounded, was clearly visible. He was 50 meters away from the enemy's positions. His car was parked at a roadblock. The staff car was on fire, and thick clouds of smoke were rising from the ditch. Fuel spilled into the ditch, and the dry grass caught fire. While all this was happening, Dietrich and Wunshi, covered from head to toe in mud, fleeing from the fire, lay down in a narrow pipe that passed under the road crossing. 5 of our T4 medium tanks and a platoon of T2 light tanks went on the attack in the direction of the outskirts of Eskelberg. Tanks, moving to the left of the road, advanced through the park, which was stubbornly defended by the British. The British set fire to the fuel, which was poured onto the paths of the park, so that further advance of the tanks became impossible. The entire location of our regiment was subjected to intense shelling. It was only around 3 o'clock in the afternoon that the 3rd Battalion of the Leibstandard managed to break into the southeastern part of Worms. Our commander Sepp Dietrich was finally rescued from his predicament at 4 o'clock by the assault group of the 1st Battalion of the Leibstandard under the command of Ernst Meyer. Unfortunately, the commander of one of the assault detachments was killed. He was the first non-commissioned officer of the regiment to be awarded the Iron Cross First Class for the Polish campaign. The 2nd Battalion of the Leibstandard was steadily rushing forward, despite the stubborn resistance of the enemy, who was standing to the death. Our grenadiers took house after house and about 5 o'clock in the evening were able to make their way to the Worm Market Square. All enemy counterattacks were repulsed. During a sudden attack by enemy tanks, the commander of the 2nd Battalion of the Leibstandard, Sturmbannführer Schutzek, was wounded. 2 enemy tanks were shot down and caught fire. The regiment captured 11 officers and 320 enemy soldiers. A huge number of artillery pieces, vehicles and ammunition were captured in Worms. At 11 o'clock in the evening, our regiment, supported by tanks, resumed the attack and forced the British to retreat. 6 more British officers and 430 enlisted men were captured during the night. By dawn, the regiment, without encountering serious resistance, reached the most important road. The enemy troops in the regiment's sector were completely dispersed and tried to flee north to Dunkirk, abandoning military equipment and equipment. The roads leading to the coast and the harbor of Dunkirk were completely clogged. Endless columns of British trucks, tanks, and guns made any movement on them impossible. The amount of military equipment thrown by the enemy was huge. The retreat of the British took the character of a disorderly flight. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, an order was transmitted from the headquarters of the 16th Tank Corps to withdraw from the battle and prepare for the march. The motorized SS regiment, Leibstandard, Adolf Hitler, came under the operational control of the 9th Panzer Division and had to pursue the enemy fleeing to Dunkirk. But at 6 o'clock in the evening, for unknown reasons, this order was cancelled. And again we only watched the British, remaining inactive. We were not allowed to continue the offensive. It remained to watch as the British left Dunkirk and disappeared over the English Channel under the blows of our aircraft. What would have been the further course of the war if von Kleist's Panzer Group had been allowed to continue the planned operation against Dunkirk and capture the British Expeditionary Force, one can only imagine. The battle against the British was over. We did not participate in the final phase of the Dunkirk operation. On the 4th of June, the regiment was transferred to the command of the 6th Army and ended up in the Cambrai area. The Battle of the Somme began, and the French positions here were subjected to powerful blows by German troops, which quickly led to a number of front breakthroughs. Our regiment was nearby to move in the direction of Amiens or Péronne through the forks of the Bapaume roads. The enemy pulled up fresh forces. Probably, they were ordered to stop the deep breakthrough of the German troops and buy time for the withdrawal of the French troops fighting on the Somme in order to have time to create a new line of defense behind the Oise. But there was also the possibility that the enemy would try to quickly retreat to the south during the night. Therefore, on the 8th of June, it was planned to attack with 4 divisions and break through in a southwesterly direction. The regiment was placed under the operational control of the 3rd Tank Division. The attack started according to plan. The breakthrough of the French front was expanded. On the 9th of June, we were suddenly transferred to the site of the 46th Army Corps and received orders to advance to Soissons, and then in a southeasterly direction. By the time my motorcycle riflemen crossed the Aisne River west of Soissons, they were dead tired. But there was no time to sleep. We had to pass through the forest at Villers-Cotterêts overnight, and then come out to La Ferté-Milon. In the dead of night, we drove into a dark forest and slowly moved along a road that was heavily damaged by mines and bombs. The 124th Infantry Regiment was encamped on both sides of the high road in the forest. Soon we passed our last combat guard positions and drove out into no man's land. French soldiers voluntarily surrendered. They mostly belonged to the 11th French Division. We were hindered by a dense beech forest, where we expected at any moment to stumble upon the enemy, and every sound seemed to indicate the presence of the enemy. This advance through the forest obviously had a special meaning for Sepp Dietrich. It was here during the First World War that he first took part in a tank operation and destroyed his first enemy tank. About 4 o'clock we reached Villers-Cotterêts and captured a number of French soldiers. The whole situation already bore the stamp of the imminent collapse of the French army. The scattered units of the 11th Division of the French offered only weak resistance. At 10 o'clock in the morning we moved in the direction of La Ferté-Milon and in the forest 4 kilometers south of Villers-Cotterêts captured some more soldiers of the 11th Division. At a short distance from La Ferté-Milon, our advanced units came under fire from enemy infantry, but then the village was quickly taken. The 1st Battalion of the Leibstandard managed to take Château-Thierry on the move and advance to the blown-up railway bridge. Château-Thierry, an important city for the Germans, was abandoned by the French, but heavy artillery fire rained down on its empty streets, turning the sleeping city into a rather uncomfortable place. On the 11th of June, my vanguard proceeded in the direction of Monrenil. We broke through several enemy resistance lines on the move. I could hardly restrain my grenadiers. The rush to the Marne has begun. The next day at 6 o'clock in the morning we drove through Monrenil and surprised the French during their wake-up call. They willingly dropped their weapons and went out onto the main street. At 9 o'clock we reached the Marne at Saint-Aug. The enemy columns on the southern bank of the river were scattered by fire from heavy machine guns and automatic cannons, even before we gave up our position to the 2nd Battalion of the Leibstandard Adolf Hitler, and undertook to pursue the already defeated enemy. Despite the fact that we had achieved our intended goals, access to the northern bank of the Marne, the 2nd Battalion of the Leibstandard crossed the river at Saint-Aug to create a bridgehead, and thus provided the possibility of a subsequent attack on the railway embankment at the bend of the Marne. At 7 o'clock in the evening Moilly was taken, the embankment was captured. With the creation of this bridgehead, further operations over the next few days went more smoothly, and the enemy was deprived of the opportunity to gain a foothold in the bend of the Marne. During the night, the regiment was again subordinated to the 9th Panzer Division. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon of the unforgettable 14th of June, we listened to a special program. German troops enter Paris early in the morning. Soldiers of the 11th Company of the Leibstandard Adolf Hitler broke into the church and began ringing the bells. We stood in silence and listened to the solemn ringing. No one was having fun, no victorious toasts were made, no bonfires were lit. Touched, we took it as a fact and watched the squadrons of our U-87 dive bombers flying through the Marne and bringing death south of Paris. In the evening of the same day, one of our best junior commanders died a brave death. He became an example for his entire platoon. We continued to advance south through Montmirail and Nevers with orders to establish a bridgehead across the Allier River near Moulins. The bridge on the motorway was blown up by the French before our eyes. The explosion occurred at the very time when the lieutenant of the 10th Infantry Regiment tried to cross to the opposite shore. The officer fell together with the bridge into the fast waters of the Loire. However, we managed to capture the railway bridge. It was set on fire by the French, but the fire could not destroy the metal structure of the bridge, and we were able to create a bridgehead. The enemy offered only weak resistance, although the French High Command still had 70 combat-ready divisions at its disposal. But the French army no longer wanted to fight. We met only isolated pockets of serious resistance. On the 19th of June I received an order to scout the road. At dawn, my vanguard advanced through wooded and hilly terrain, clearing its way with cannon and machine gun fire. The retreating French units again tried to create a defensive line to gain time. These attempts didn't bother us much anymore. We had only one goal, to advance further south. The flanks were no longer important. We moved along the roads like a fire-breathing dragon. It was impossible to stop. The fire was conducted only from combat vehicles and motorcycles on the move. Our offensive was beginning to look like a wild hunt. About 10 o'clock in the morning we reached a small hill and looked down at St. Pourçon. I was moving with the advance party and saw how the French soldiers were trying their best to erect a barricade on the road at the entrance to the city. The terrain on both sides of the road was open, and the road for about 800 meters in the direction of St. Pourçon went downhill. These unfavorable terrain conditions prevented a proper attack of the city. Therefore, I decided to take the French by surprise and capture their positions with a lightning attack. For this surprise attack, I chose an advanced unit under the command of SS Obersturmführer Knittel. I ordered the rest of the attacking platoon to follow 100 meters behind and provide the forward squad with fire cover. The French still had no idea that we were already so close to St. Pourçon. They calmly collected any available material to barricade the entrance to the city. Suddenly, for the French, our first motorcycle with a sidecar rolled down the hill and, like lightning, jumped out onto the road, shooting on the move. The other motorcycles followed him at full speed. Armored vehicles followed on both sides of the road and fired from their 20mm automatic guns, clearing the way for the advancing motorcyclists. Mortars were hitting the city. In just a few seconds, hell broke loose. I hurried after the advanced unit and saw fleeing and terrified French soldiers, panic-stricken, running out of houses into the street. Frantically gesticulating officers tried in vain to force the soldiers to fight. The shock was too great, and effective defense was no longer possible. Only bullets from individual rifle shots whistled over our heads. In a short time, a breach was made in the French barricade, wide enough for us to pass through. The French installed a 75mm cannon here, but its crew did not have time to open fire, our advanced units acted so quickly. However, the first confusion of the enemy had passed, and it was impractical to continue the attack on cars. We were now advancing on both sides of the road in a combat formation on foot. Turning onto the main street of the city, we were met with intense machine gun fire, which made us take care. But we could not delay any longer. The attack had to be carried out as soon as possible in order to prevent blowing up the bridge, which was located at the far end of the city. The advanced platoon rushed across to the bridge. The French prisoners ran back, trying to leave the danger zone. 50 meters from the bridge, the commander of the assault group, SS Obersturmführer, was wounded in the thigh and barely managed to hide behind a large elm tree before the fragments of the bridge blown up by the French flew around us. As soon as the smoke cleared a little, we were met by fierce fire from the French infantry. The opposite bank of the Sul River was slightly higher, which created excellent conditions for defense. In the current situation, we remained at the occupied line, and I asked the battalion following us to pass St. Pourçon and try to capture the bridge over the Sul River about 12 kilometers to the south. Meanwhile, behind the blown-up bridge, the enemy felt safe and had no idea that his complete defeat was a matter of the near future. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Johann Piper, the commander of the vanguard company of the 3rd Battalion of the Leibstandard Adolf Hitler, sent a report that the crossing of the Sul was completed. To top it off, an enemy company with all military equipment was captured. The 3rd Battalion of the Leibstandard was hastily ferried across the river and thrown into the attack on St. Pourçon. The battalion attacked the French from the rear and was able to complete the battle without heavy losses. My vanguard left St. Pourçon and pursued the enemy to Gunna. By 4 o'clock, Savannah was taken without a fight, and we began to conduct reconnaissance in the direction of Vichy. Massive blockages of trees on the Gunna, Vichy road prevented us from completing the task before nightfall. Shortly before reaching Vichy, we surprised an artillery unit that had stopped. Its outdated trucks could not climb the steep hill. The guns, obviously, remained from the First World War and, of course, were of little use. Probably, before that, they were being preserved somewhere in a warehouse. The motorized rifle company successfully disarmed the French without suffering losses and sent them back to Gunna on foot. A demoralized French officer stood on the road, gloomily looking at the guns. I saw that tears were pouring down his cheeks. He stammered, "What a shame. The soldiers of Verdun should not have allowed this to happen." We found that the bridge over the Allier was intact, and established contact with the German troops occupying Vichy. On the 19th of June, 17 officers and 933 soldiers were captured. All the prisoners looked exhausted and demoralized. On the 29th of June, the 2nd Battalion of the Leibstandard Adolf Hitler reached the city of Clermont-Ferrand and captured 242 aircraft of various types at the airfield. In our hands were 8 tanks, a lot of cars and other equipment. In addition, the battalion captured a major general, 300 officers and 4,000 soldiers. Captured immediately after the start of the attack in Pont du Château, the French captain volunteered to be a parliamentarian. Despite his white flag, he was killed by shots fired by French soldiers when he drew level with the French positions to ask for the surrender of the so-called open city. On the 23rd of June, our vanguard moved in the direction of Saint-Étienne and 2 kilometers north of La Fiosse came under rapid fire from behind barricades on the road. The advance unit drove into the undergrowth on both sides of the road and tried to scout the approach to the far end of the barricades. I was moving along the moat with the 2nd squad and had barely passed the anti-tank barriers when intense shelling began and a tank rolled out from behind the barricade. He was moving through an open space, firing. We, like rabbits, huddled at the bottom of an anti-tank ditch and looked at the oncoming steel hulk. Neither alive nor dead, we watched as the caterpillars moved closer and closer to the edge and seemed to slide down into the concrete moat. Finally, the tank stopped right above us, right in front of the slope of the moat. The tank and our anti-tank gun engaged in a duel at a distance of only 20 meters from each other. The anti-tank gun fired first, and after a ringing blow, we heard the shrill whistle of a ricocheting shell. But the second shell did not penetrate the tank's armor either. It turned out to be too thick for the shells of our 37mm gun. We saw how the tank rolled straight at the anti-tank gun and fired at point-blank range at the gun crew. Before reaching only a few meters to the destroyed gun, the tank turned around and returned behind the barricade. We were relieved to see that the second shell had jammed the tank's turret and the crew could no longer properly aim the gun. Unfortunately, 3 tank destroyers from the calculation of the anti-tank gun were killed. They were the last of our soldiers to die in the French campaign. From the position of the advanced unit, I could see a total of 6 enemy tanks hiding behind the barriers. They were veterans of the First World War, who were built for the planned and failed offensive of 1919, they never participated in hostilities. Half an hour later, the tanks were forced to retreat under the shells of our 150mm guns. The road to Saint-Étienne was open. The next morning, the 1st Battalion of the Leibstandard Adolf Hitler Regiment entered the city and captured several hundred more Frenchmen. At 9 o'clock in the evening on the 24th of June, we learned that an armistice had been concluded between Italy and France, although the armistice between Germany and France had been signed 2 days before, on the 22nd of June. The fighting in France is over. Was this the end of the war? The armistice agreement established a demarcation line, and on the 4th of July we had to withdraw from the occupied territory to the north. Then our regiment was transferred to the command of the 12th Army and left for Paris early in the morning. We were supposed to take part in the upcoming parade. Despite the defeat suffered by the French army, the French population was quite friendly. Shortly before reaching Paris, we learned about the sinking or capture of most of the French fleet by British ships in the ports of Oran, Dakar, Alexandria and others. This deeply shocked the French. Never before and never since have I seen so many people crying as then in France. Churchill's actions were considered not as a military action, but as a crime. Paris was surrounded by a dense ring of von Briesen's division units. It was possible to enter the city center only with permission and with a pass from the headquarters. My soldiers and I took the opportunity to see the sights of Paris. Since the planned parade was first postponed and then eventually cancelled, the regiment left Paris and moved to Metz. I asked Sepp Dietrich for permission to leave 24 hours earlier to show my soldiers the blood-soaked battlefields of the First World War at Verdun. The Battle of Verdun lasted from February 21 to December 18, 1916, and cost the Germans 600,000 killed and wounded, the French 358,000. Permission was given, after which about 100 soldiers gathered on the 28th of July, 1940th year at Fort Douaumont. Together we made our way through the casemates, which 24 years ago were taken by the brave Brandenburg Grenadiers. We stood, deeply impressed, in front of a huge casemate, the gates of which were walled up and behind which countless German soldiers found eternal rest. The pitted earth in the area around the destroyed Fort Douaumont clearly spoke for itself. Rows of craters, a picture of a lunar landscape. The low grass could not hide the suffering of this land. Trenches crisscrossed the terrain like deep wrinkles. Between Fort Douaumont and the casemate crypt, we found the fresh grave of our fallen comrade, who parted with his young life just a few weeks ago. Grave, with our heads bared, we stood at this abandoned grave and looked at the countless graves to our left. Thousands and thousands of wooden crosses lined up in orderly rows. Words were powerless to express what we were experiencing. There were invisible shelves, the former existence of which was marked with crosses. From the casemate crypt we slowly ascended to Fort Vaux and tried to imagine the incredible efforts of the German and French soldiers who lost their lives at this height in June of 1916. We climbed to the top of the hill on which the fort stood, plowed by shells, and tried to trace the path of Lieutenant Kiel, who, with about 40 grenadiers, on the 2nd of July, 1916, went to the center of the fort through the eastern moat. Soon we gave up this activity. Nothing could be found in the dug-up ground. In this place, man's penchant for destruction has changed the face of the earth. In our imagination, we imagined the dark shadows of the grenadiers advancing forward, breaking through the hurricane fire and the gap in the outer wall of the moat. We imagined how the German sappers used flamethrowers against the embrasures from which the fire was conducted, and neutralized the calculation of the cannon in the armored turret. Today, this armored tower lay smashed in front of our feet. When I was telling my soldiers about the situation of the French garrison, it seemed to me that I could hear the deafening roar of the French artillery, which was trying to suppress the German grenadiers who had taken the fort. In the dark corridors of the fort, we found traces of fire on the walls and ceilings of the casemates and learned the effect of German flamethrowers. Shocked, we stood at the cistern, which was partly responsible for the fall, after 3 months of struggle, of the fort, and vividly felt the agony of the French soldiers dying of unbearable thirst. But the Germans, who took the fort on the 7th of June, found themselves in the same situation. Sweat and blood were on every bottle of water that got into the fort after going through a storm of fire and metal. Visiting this historic place turned my comrades into silent listeners. Without uttering a single word, they surrounded me as I told them about the heroic battles of the 8th of June, 1916. The French attacked 7 times that day, trying to retake the fort. But the exhausted Germans fought like possessed. They were not going to surrender the fortress taken at the cost of so many sacrifices. At dusk we passed through a group of 21 soldiers and 2 German officers, who then broke through the French barrage and reinforced the detachment of the defenders. These were the remains of 2 German companies. All the others remained on the battlefield. Under the cover of night, our cars were moving in an easterly direction. Visiting the battlefield has made us more cautious. Verdun taught us that, despite the 2 campaigns we have endured, we still have not experienced the terrible hardships that befell our fathers. Formation of a reconnaissance battalion in Metz. On the 29th of July we camped at the fort in Metz. The fort was located to the west of the Moselle, and it offers a view into the distance of the picturesque Moselle Valley. In the fort we found old batteries of German Krupp guns of the early 20th century. There was even ammunition for them. They were stored, neatly laid out, next to the guns. The inventory of the guns was also of German origin. The German gunners were forced to surrender these guns, as well as the lands of Lorraine and Alsace, conquered by Prussia in 1871 to the French in 1919. Having spent a lot of work and effort, we managed to adapt the fort to accommodate troops. The fortress was to become a training camp for the newly created reconnaissance detachment Leibstandard Adolf Hitler. Since August, the Leibstandard regiment has been deployed in a brigade. I was entrusted with its formation in August. The basis of the units could be the 15th Motorized Company, a platoon of armored vehicles and a platoon of motorcycle messengers of the former regiment that were at my disposal. I was allowed to select additional personnel from the Motorcycle Replenishment Battalion. I didn't have to search for volunteers for a long time. The young motorcycle riflemen wanted to join the combat units and were happy to leave their rear barracks. Excellent, strong young soldiers surrounded me as soon as I asked if there were any volunteers. They were young men who had just turned 18 and had been soldiers for only 6 weeks. Within a few days, the new battalion in Metz was manned and began an intensive training program. The young guys could do anything. They enthusiastically followed the instructions of their instructors and turned into a team hardened like steel. The old battlefields became a training area for motorcyclists and scouts in armored vehicles. In the years that have passed since the defeat of Germany in World War II, the Waffen-SS, and especially about their composition, a lot of absurdities have been written. I think you should get an idea of the origin and social composition of a typical SS unit. As an example, I will give an excerpt from the registration log of the 2nd Motorcycle Company of the Leibstandard Adolf Hitler Reconnaissance Squad. Soldiers before conscription were engaged in the following areas of professional activity. Technical professions, 42%. Trade, 22%. Individual work activity, 14%. Agriculture, 7%. Unqualified, 15%. The average age of the soldiers was 19 years. The average age of non-commissioned officers was 26 years. In total, the servicemen of the unit had 450 brothers and sisters. All regions of the Reich were represented. It can be said with full justification that these troops represented a cross-section of German society and were neither a unit of the offspring of important people, nor mercenaries. 48 officers, non-commissioned officers and soldiers of this magnificent company were killed during the 6 months from the 10th of July to the 31st of December, 1941. 122 were wounded during the same period. In the heavy defensive battles near Rostov in December 1941, the numerical composition of the company was reduced to a platoon. How dare today's public figures call these honest and self-sacrificing young people soldiers of the party? These guys fought for Germany and, of course, did not die for the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which ruled the country in those years. In the autumn of 1940, I was seconded to staff officer training courses in Alsace. The head teacher of the course, the commander of the 73rd Infantry Division, Lieutenant General Beeler, was an excellent specialist. During my studies, I met a couple of colleagues with whom I would later go through several serious situations together in Greece and Russia. At this time, the units of the Leibstandard were practicing Operation Sea Lion and training in the amphibious landing. The Moselle River was a favorite place for training. In conditions of secrecy, the training switched to conducting combat operations in mountainous terrain. We were riding motorcycles at breakneck speed on the steep slopes of the Moselle Hill. The area surrounding the fortress with its high walls and moats looked like a circus. We even trained in climbing and descending the rocks, with motorcycles and anti-tank guns. By spring, we expected to become a well-trained unit, ready for combat operations in any conditions. Soldiers, non-commissioned officers and officers worked with heavy weapons as a single team and smoothly as clockwork. Colonel General Blaskowitz praised our efforts in his speech. General von Korsfleisch said the same thing the last time we were checked in Metz. The unit was ready for action and was waiting for the order. The Balkans. During the First World War, the Germans had a hard time on the southeastern flank. In the autumn of 1916, at the very time when we were making the bloodiest sacrifices in the west, on the Somme, in the east, against the Russian southwestern front of General Brusilov, and in the south near Isonzo, the Allied powers completed the encirclement of Germany as a result of Romania's entry into the war on their side. For almost 3 long years, the Central Powers fought with the Allied army in the rugged mountains of Macedonia, the Thessaloniki front. But only in September 1918, the forces of the Allied coalition, the French, the Serbs and the British, under the command of General Franchet d'Espery, managed to break through the defenses of the Germans and Bulgarians. With 29 divisions of the Allies, he reached the Danube, thereby deciding the fate of our allies, Bulgaria, which signed the armistice on September 29, 1918, Turkey, on September 30 and Austria, Hungary, on November 3. What role the Balkans were to play in this war, in the spring of 1941, one could only guess. It was clear that Winston Churchill was again exerting a decisive influence on British strategy. He was the one who organized the landing at Gallipoli in 1915 and then in Thessaloniki. In the spring of 1941, London kept the expeditionary forces in the Mediterranean on alert and then landed them in Greece. In mid-February, British Foreign Secretary Eden and General John Dill, Chief of the British General Staff, were in Athens to discuss the deployment of British troops in Greece. In January, the first units of German regular troops entered Romania. These soldiers, as it was said, from training units, found a warm welcome among the population. At the beginning of February, we also received an order to perform. No one knew where this trip would lead. We crossed the Rhine from Strasbourg, and then proceeded through the amazingly beautiful areas of southern Germany to Bohemia. After passing Prague, we headed straight south, and the next morning we saw the outlines of Budapest. Continuing through the Hungarian steppes, our train approached the Romanian border. We got acquainted with the Transylvanian Germans, mostly Saxons, and their beautiful country near the Hungarian-Romanian border, and were greeted with extraordinary hospitality and cordiality in Brasov, Germanstadt and many other outstanding cities and villages in the Carpathians, which have long been inhabited by Germans. Our troops were stationed in the Kimpulung area. This formerly quiet station of the narrow-gauge railway has been completely transformed. There was a lot of activity everywhere. In the very first hour of our march along the road, an incident happened to me that had a response in the future. A Romanian lieutenant colonel, who was swearing at bad roads, asked me to pull his stuck small car out of the mud. There was a woman sitting in the car, obviously in severe pain. I quickly forgot about this case. However, in 1943, a Romanian colonel came up to me in Debrecen Skramnica and greeted me warmly. He kept telling his comrades that I was the savior of his wife and son. It took me quite a while to remember what he meant. The Romanian said that when the car got stuck, his wife was on her way to the maternity hospital and was about to give birth. They arrived at the hospital just in time, and the wife gave birth to a son. Naturally, we celebrated our meeting in Germany. After several weeks of parking in Kimpulung, we marched south to Bulgaria along muddy roads with deep ruts. Tank tracks sank deeper and deeper into the ground, and repair columns worked continuously. Bare wide expanses with almost no elevations or forest areas were visible on both sides of the road. From time to time we passed another poor village, in which, apart from a well and several dirty huts deeply embedded in the ground with several windows open to all winds, there was nothing else. Then one morning we saw a wide, earthy brown ribbon of the slowly flowing Danube. To the south of the Danube, the mountains of Bulgaria were visible in the misty haze. The sun flooded the earth with its mercilessly scorching rays when we entered Bulgaria over the bridge built by our military engineers. The Bulgarians greeted us joyfully. Many memories of the First World War were awakened, and Bulgarian peasants proudly showed us German awards. The march through the infamous Shipka Pass road was unforgettable. Dangerous sharp turns of the narrow road were nevertheless overcome rapidly under the supervision of repair teams. When nothing helped on the ascents, the Bulgarians borrowed their draft bulls. The long columns rolled steadily in a southerly direction, past Sofia into the Strumitsa Valley. There was a danger of crashing on the sharp ledges of rocks on the road. Drivers hardly managed to fit their heavy cars on the turns of narrow mountain roads covered with a thick layer of dust. These roads with their potholes, steep ascents and descents, turns that required the maximum possible from cars and drivers, have not seen such a huge amount of transport for many days. A 20-kilometer traffic jam formed in the Strumitsa Valley, which became a particularly serious obstacle to the movement of our troops. Sappers and military engineers built a new road, leveling it all the time, blowing up rocks and erecting new bridges. The danger of delaying the advance of troops soon passed. The columns quickly crossed the valley and dispersed into several valleys. High mountain ranges, hidden canyons and wide valleys effectively hid huge military formations. A large amount of fuel, ammunition and other supplies were stored near the roads. The approach march was completed. The assault companies were ready. Meanwhile, anti-German circles, incited by the British, seized power in Belgrade, and the original pro-Russian sentiments in Serbia played a special role. During the uprising, on the night of the 26th to the 27th of March, the pro-German government was overthrown, and Prince Regent Pavel was forced to leave the country. As a result, the situation in the Balkans has changed dramatically. The new government renounced the alliance with Germany and on April 5, 1941, concluded a treaty of friendship and non-aggression with the Soviet Union. After the coup in Belgrade, Hitler had already decided to eliminate the Yugoslav threat to our flank. In addition to the 1st Panzer Group of General von Kleist, operating from the territory of Bulgaria, and the 2nd Army of General von Wakes, concentrated in the former Austria, which were supposed to break through to Belgrade and occupy the north of Yugoslavia, the 12th Army under the command of Field Marshal General List, also from Bulgaria, attacked the south of Yugoslavia, on Skopje, and then advanced to Greece. The 12th Army had at its disposal 16 divisions plus the infantry regiment, Great Germany, and our SS brigade, Leibstandard. Hitler ordered an attack on Yugoslavia on the 6th of April, following the conclusion of the Non-Aggression and Friendship Pact between the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia on the 5th of April. The hot spring day was coming to an end. The heat in the Strumica Valley was almost unbearable. Due to the events in Yugoslavia, we moved to the northern part of the valley in Kustendil, which is located 20 kilometers from the Bulgarian-Yugoslav border. The 9th Panzer Division had already reached this border town and had orders to march on Skopje and, if possible, take this important hub town. We were to follow the 9th Panzer Division almost all the way to Skopje, then turn south and follow the Greek border through Prilep and Bitalia. My reinforced battalion formed up on the square in front of me. Darkness enveloped us when I told my comrades the most important details of our upcoming operation. They listened in silence as I explained the task of our vanguard and pointed out the expected problems. I also felt it necessary to remind them of the fierce battles that our fathers fought in the First World War in the mountains of Macedonia and during the capture of Monastir, a city for which a sea of blood was shed at that time and which was now one of our first goals. We wanted to take him swiftly and suddenly. When I spoke about this, I felt for the first time the boundless trust that bound me to my soldiers. I could lead them to hell and they would follow me. The night was damp and warm, little was said, and most of the soldiers smoked. Everyone wanted to be alone with their thoughts before the operation itself. A silvery moon cast a dim light on the soldiers, who were bent over, walking next to their motorcycles. The steep bare slope of the mountain ominously went up, opening before us as soon as dawn broke. The white road snaked steeply up the slope, and we knew that firing points and dragon's teeth were waiting for us at the Sticker Pass. The vanguard of the 9th Panzer Division left at dawn, moving westward across the natural border of a low mountain range. Beyond the Sticker Pass, he came across Yugoslav fortifications. Our heavy guns started talking. 88mm anti-aircraft guns and heavy anti-tank guns destroyed enemy firing points. In a matter of minutes, they turned into smoking ruins. Everything looked somehow unreal. Far to the east the blood-red sun was rising, and in the valleys the morning mist was mixed with dense clouds of dust. Bursts of red tracer bullets from our machine guns were leaving the pass we had captured down into the valley. Suddenly enemy planes appeared. Flying low over the mountains, they circled over the road in the valley and attacked Kjestendal. When the bombs fell on the city, its streets and roads in the vicinity were clogged with columns of our troops. Thank God, the losses were small, but, unfortunately, the commander of the 2nd Battalion of our motorized infantry brigade SS, Leibstandard, Adolf Hitler was seriously wounded. Moving in columns, we got closer and closer to the border and finally reached it in the late afternoon. The 9th Panzer Division had already broken through the border fortifications and was advancing deep into Yugoslavia. The main tank unit was advancing on Skopje, firing on the move. We descended from the pass past destroyed border and road barriers and skillfully placed small concrete firing points. We came across numerous prisoners, among whom were many Germans from the Banat, who greeted us with loud cheers and shook hands with us. The corpses of dead horses, already bloated under the southern sun, lay in the trench. Live horses galloped across the fields or stood listlessly at the edge of the road. The difficult terrain was replaced by a somewhat different one. There are fewer mountains. The high snow-capped peaks were left behind. We came across our first damaged tanks and fresh graves near Kumanovo, which testified to a brutal battle for the city. Darkness descended quickly. The darkness of the southern night quickly thickened over the marching column. Soon we were to reach a road fork south of Skopje. From Velis onwards, we had to assume the role of a shock vanguard during the offensive to the south through Prilep and Monastir. We reached the last outposts of the 9th Panzer Division shortly after midnight and were preparing to enter no man's land. Before the forward guard platoon took the vanguard, I once again instructed its soldiers and commanders, informed them about the situation that was developing for us and wished my comrades all the best. I admonished the platoon that was leaving into the darkness with the words, "Guys, the night belongs to a good soldier." The motorcycles set off, slowly at first, then faster and faster. It was reminiscent of the Dutch campaign. Soon I discovered that Varvzenek personally took command and without further ado rushed to the south. But here were not the smooth asphalt roads of Holland and France. Our progress was connected with crossing narrow mountain roads and gorges. The road to Prilep rose steeply. After a short time, the first bullets whistled over our head. Some enemy soldiers were holed up somewhere in the mountains and tried to stop our offensive. I followed the advance squad. A short command was enough to continue the movement. Forward, and only forward. Our goal is to seize the territory to the south and take advantage of the enemy's confusion. At the foot of a small hill behind the village, we came under fire again. Armored vehicles provided support to the attacking motorcycle shooters and hit the enemy with tracer shells. Motorcyclists combed the village. The first participation in the fighting of our battalion led to the complete confusion of more than 100 Yugoslavs. The enemy officers cursed their outposts in the mountains. They listened incredulously to our interpreter's explanation that the fire from their outposts did not become a hindrance for us and we just continued to move south. In half an hour it was all over. The motorcycle shooters were rushing forward. There was no holding them back. We kept moving on. In a frenzied race along the mountain road and over the bridges over the precipices, we surprised the enemy's battery on the march. After a couple of minutes, the excitement subsided. With a clang and a roar, the captured guns fell into the abyss. At dawn we arrived in Prilep and contacted the vanguard of the 73rd Infantry Division. The battalion was commanded by Major Stiffader, with whom I studied at the refresher courses. Stiffader, moving from the east, reached Prilep without major losses. Looks like it could have been a hot day. We allowed ourselves a short and so necessary rest. We have made great progress towards the strategically important city of Monastir. At the very dawn, a fine rain began to fall. It mixed with the dust and turned it into grey sticky mud. Anxiously we peered into the fleeing shadows of the night. The road now led to a plain, with the outlines of only one high mountain appearing on the right. Because of the turn, we saw the Krna River, where we noticed a solid bridge with steel arches. It had not yet been blown up. Several trucks and horse-drawn enemy wagons were approaching the bridge. I saw only the bridge, nothing else interested me. He was supposed to fall into our hands unharmed. Two armored vehicles separated from the marching column and opened fire from their 20mm automatic cannons on the distant approaches to the bridge. Our advanced vehicles rushed to the bridge as if they were being driven by the devil himself. Horse-drawn Yugoslav carts and trucks, trying to get away from us, collided in an effort to overtake each other and created congestion. They were only 100 meters away from us. Stray bullets whistled past us. I could already see the bridge intact in my hands, but then, echoing through the entire valley of the river, a deafening explosion followed. The bridge blew up in the air right before my eyes and collapsed into the water. Horses, soldiers and enemy vehicles were thrown into the air along with the bridge, and they were swallowed up by the stormy waters of the Krna. A Yugoslavian machine gun was fired. Horrified at first, then furious, and finally coldly assessing the situation, I approached the remains of the blown-up bridge. The commander of the 2nd Company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Squad, Hauptsturmführer Kras, was standing next to me. The situation was quickly assessed and the decision was made. The enemy could not be given time to rest. He had to be pursued. We were lucky. The metal structure protruded above the water, and it could be used as the base of a temporary bridge. The grenadiers on the ruins quickly prepared temporary positions. The sapper units that came up were erecting a new crossing as if they were doing it on an exercise. The motorcyclists crossed the river and reconnoitered the road to Monastir. The bridge was growing before our eyes, and soon the first heavy armored vehicles crossed the river. The offensive continued. The 2nd Company came forward again. The railway ran to the left of the road along which we were moving forward. Behind its embankment the enemy's riflemen were crawling, trying in vain to delay our rapid advance. The armored vehicles simply fired several machine gun bursts at the enemy lying behind the embankment and on it. Everyone else was looking straight ahead. We wanted to take Monastir on the move, nothing else mattered. The railway embankment was getting closer and closer to the highway, crossing it a few hundred meters ahead of us. The forward squad stopped, and the grenadiers jumped into a ditch on both sides of the road. There was a house, which was a hotbed of resistance. A 50mm anti-tank gun took up a position under enemy fire and fired a couple of times at the walls. The house shattered into pieces with a crash. Only then did I notice that the enemy on the embankment became more active, emboldened by the stop of our vanguard. A machine gun hammered from behind the embankment, showering us with a hail of bullets and leaving us no choice but to accept the challenge. The matter was quickly settled thanks to the fire from armored vehicles. The surviving Yugoslav soldiers fled to a swampy lowland behind a railway embankment. I was about to jump into the motorcycle of SS Unterscharfer while, when the renewed fire of several Yugoslavs again pinned us to the ground. My tablet was riddled with bullets, its fragments lay on the edge of the ditch. Enemy bullets rattled on the grass, churned up the damp earth around us. A gurgling sound made me look at Vale. He was writhing at the bottom of the ditch, his lower jaw was crushed and hanging down. We couldn't afford to be stuck here. The enemy could not be allowed to press us on the approaches to Monastir and knock us out of these high hills. I shouted to the advanced units. Motorcyclists, like acrobats, jumped into their motorcycles and rushed forward. The advanced units, like a magnet, attracted the rest of the battalion. We raced along a slippery road soaked with rain. It rained all day, while the sun began to break through the veil of ragged clouds. The resistance of the Yugoslavs was growing. The tracer bullets of their machine guns whistled viciously, piercing through the haystacks that served as a kind of shelter, turning them into giant torches. Monastir was right in front of us. We have already seen the city spread out among the mountains. On the slope to my right, I saw an enemy battery, which was just taking up a position. Go ahead. There is no time to put out fires. We had to enter the city. We wanted to grab the defenders by the throat. We were fascinated by the speed. We fired machine guns in bursts at the enemy on both sides of the road. A half-erected roadblock appeared right in front of us. Fire! Bursts of armored vehicles ripped through the air, and hand grenades flew into the barricade. In complete confusion, the dumbfounded defenders rushed for cover. Contrary to the enemy's expectations, we did not advance on a broad front. Instead, we acted unconventionally, like a dagger thrust. The battalion entered the city in a column. Only artillery was not with us. She took up positions and fired over our heads. I didn't see any churches, minarets, or other buildings, only machine gun nests, defenders in houses, and the determination of the enemy. The battalion was moving further and further into the city. I had lost my maps, but I knew where the barracks were. We wanted to get to them, because that's where we would find the command post that controlled the enemy's actions. The enemy soldiers stationed on the square scattered as soon as our motorcycles roared around the corner. The enemy fired at us from all windows, roofs, and gardens. Armored vehicles have proven their reliability. Their weapons reached every suspicious-looking corner and forced enemy shooters to seek shelter. Under the cover of fire from armored vehicles, 2 heavy 150mm guns took up position. From 200 meters they opened fire on the barracks. The result was impressive. Within 20 minutes, Monastir had lost almost all of its defenders, with the exception of a hotbed of resistance at the railway station. A sapper unit fought here, the battle with which ended within an hour. Our offensive has confirmed what we have learned over the years of study. A car is a weapon. For several hours, prisoners who were indifferent to everything were brought in and disarmed. We captured an entire artillery battalion without firing a shot. But the fight had to continue. We had no time to rest. The Yugoslav forces were located on Lake Ohrid and occupied the Javet Pass 20 kilometers west of Monastir, on the road leading to Lake Presna and further to Lake Ohrid. We knew that a significant British force that had landed in Greece was approaching from the south and moving towards the city of Florina. There was a lot of pressure on me, demanding a decision on our next actions. We were alone in Monastir and could not count on support for the next 24 hours. I had to move in 2 directions, as well as hold the city with captured prisoners, artillery, and railway workers. Kras' reinforced company was instructed to cross the Javet Pass and try to establish contact with the Italians who were in Albania west of Lake Ohrid. Schroeder's company was ordered to scout the British positions south of the city and not lose sight of the enemy. If possible, it was necessary to prevent the British from leaving the Klidi Pass. Both company commanders looked at me in amazement when they received these orders. Hugo Kras shook his head in disbelief. The situation for Schroeder was not so bad at all. He had a lot of room for maneuver, and, with the good condition of the roads, he had all the possibilities for reconnaissance. The companies set off. My motorcyclists, tank destroyers, sappers, and grenadiers rode past me with joyful laughter. They were going into the darkness, into the unknown. The staff of the headquarters prepared for defense and maintained radio communication. We kept in constant contact with the companies and received messages from armored vehicles. We were constantly aware of their whereabouts. Within a few minutes, Kras attacked a battery located in the gardens area to the west of Monastir, which surrendered. I was still waiting for the order to open fire. By midnight, Kras had passed through several villages and was at the foot of the Javet Pass. Intelligence reported that the pass was occupied, and a well-equipped defensive position was set up along the crest of the mountain ridge. Enemy reconnaissance groups were captured. The attack of the pass was to begin at dawn. Schroeder also acted successfully and soon reported from the Greek territory, from Florina and Vavi. A curious incident occurred between these 2 settlements with the company. As the old saying goes, all cats are black at night. The next morning, Schroeder submitted the following report. I sent several reconnaissance groups from the crossroads and slowly followed the first one, which was conducting reconnaissance in the direction of Florina. Soon after, 2 armored reconnaissance vehicles emerged from the darkness, heading in our direction. Unaware of anything, we continued to move forward. I thought it was ours. We realized our mistake only when they were 2 meters behind us. 2 British armored cars stopped in front of us, then slowly moved on. They didn't understand who was in front of them. Apparently, they mistook us for Serbs. Having calmed down, I moved the company a few hundred meters forward and waited for the return of the British armored vehicles. Half an hour later they fell victim to our ambush on the road. We were able to find out about the intentions of the enemy. Australian troops, as part of the British forces, they occupied a hill and blocked the valley with extensive minefields. Schroeder kept the British in sight and continued his reconnaissance by combat. Our heavy guns and mortars obviously deceived the enemy about the true strength of our forces, and the British did not stick out because of their barriers. Kras' attack on the Javet Pass began early in the morning. The road here rose steeply uphill, so there was no question of a surprise attack. Sharp turns followed one after another. Almost sheer precipices, gorges, overhanging rocks and bare, treeless spaces completed the picture. The pass was 1,179 meters high. It bordered on madness to risk attacking it with only one reinforced company. But our trump card was surprise. No one expected such a rapid advance, and absolutely no one could have imagined that only one company could risk attacking the pass. I went ahead to Kras' company before dawn. I was very worried and wanted to participate in the attack myself. We passed the World War I memorial just north of Monastir. There, on the heights, in a foreign land, countless German soldiers rest. Suddenly I saw the 20mm tracer shells of automatic guns, like pearl necklaces, soaring up into the mountains. Kras' attacking company could only be supported by armored vehicles. Motorcyclists turned into mountain rangers. All night they climbed to the pass on both sides of the road and found themselves right in front of the enemy positions on the ridge. Several Yugoslav positions were bypassed and attacked from the rear. Quite energetically, the company commander led his soldiers to attack, and they quickly captured the positions of the Serbs on the ridge. A surprisingly significant contribution to the victory was made by the psychological effect of the use of heavy guns. The bursts of large-caliber shells created an infernal noise. I followed the armored car and took part in the last battle for the pass. Tkaka's group eliminated the last hotbed of resistance here. I found Hugo Kras behind a small chapel and congratulated him on his success. Several hundred prisoners were lying or standing in front of us. A whole battalion surrendered. The result was simply unfathomable. Our battalion in the place of the enemy could withstand the attacks of more than one regiment, but here one company attacked, from our side. The commander of the enemy battalion explained to us what had happened. He said, "When my soldiers heard yesterday that German troops had already reached Monastir and would appear in front of our positions by nightfall, their will to resist was significantly weakened. The very fact that we would have to fight with German soldiers unnerved my battalion. Your bombardment, meaning the shelling from heavy infantry guns, completed the job." From the crest of the pass we looked down at the dull sheen of the blue Lake Presna. And from the mountain, the bright lights of Florina were also visible. The city was ours even before the enemy found out that his battalion, surrounded on the pass, had surrendered. We didn't have any free motorcycles on hand, but several armored vehicles were ready to descend into the valley and take the enemy by surprise. While we were slowly, by touch, making our way down, following the turns of the serpentine road, Kras' company gathered and waited for their cars. We reached the valley without encountering the enemy, and rushed to the city of Ohrid. I was in Bugelzak's armored car. This SS Oberscharfer was the commander of my best reconnaissance group and perfectly oriented in the current situation. The fleeing Serbs rushed away from the road and sought shelter in the thickets. Others dropped their weapons and moved towards the pass. In this case, we could not stop. We had to enter the city and take advantage of the confusion. Under machine gun bursts, the road became free. The surprise factor worked 100%. Within a few minutes we were launching red rockets into the sky. Kras' company soon broke into the city and sent reconnaissance groups into the mountains to the west of Lake Ohrid to establish contact with the Italians. Within a few hours it was done. The first task of the reconnaissance battalion was completed quickly, successfully, and without unnecessary losses. I was proud of my soldiers and knew that I could rely on them in everything. I reported the latest success of my battalion to the commander of the Leibstandard and together with him went to Schroeder's company, where we met with the commander of the 1st Battalion of the Leibstandard Adolf Hitler, SS Sturm Bannführer. His battalion was ordered to take the key positions of the British defending the Klidi Pass, thus allowing the breakthrough of the Leibstandard and the 9th Panzer Division. The New Zealanders and Australians dug in properly on the mountain slope of the Klidi Pass. The enemy had time to create an impressive defense system here. Their artillery observers had a wide view of the plain on which our troops were to appear. Monastir was a kind of gateway blocking the way from the Klidi Pass, and the pass was the gateway from Yugoslavia to Greece. The enemy had all the advantages. Numerous minefields on the pass excluded the attack of armored vehicles. Our infantry had to take the heights in a difficult battle. The invasion of Greece. A sunny summer day, as it often happens in the mountains, was replaced by a rainy evening, and then by the icy cold of the night. Snow covered the slopes. Soldiers of the 1st Battalion of the Leibstandard Adolf Hitler faced significantly superior enemy forces. He is thoroughly entrenched in anticipation of our attack. It happened at dawn on the 12th of August. The whistling of heavy shells broke the silence. Heavy anti-aircraft guns began to destroy the detected pockets of resistance, self-propelled guns rolled forward. I was standing at the optical tube, watching the attack of the 1st Company of the motorized SS Brigade Leibstandard Adolf Hitler under the command of SS Obersturmführer Plays. Shots were still raining down from the mountain, the whole top was in smoke, and the air smelled of earth and gunpowder. Suddenly the artillery fire stopped. The infantry rushed to the attack, making their way up the mountain. Heavy self-propelled guns from the valley climbed up the slopes. We watched in amazement as the self-propelled guns moved forward. They were getting higher and higher, and then they joined the fight. No one thought they could be used here, but now they were up there, providing invaluable support to the infantry. Completely shaken by the unexpected German gunfire, the surrendered British descended from the pass. They were tall, strong guys and serious rivals. Our infantry advanced deeper and deeper into the British defense system. To clear the way for armored vehicles, our sappers engaged in minefields. But the infantry still had to do the hardest work, knocking the British out of their positions. We saw SS Sturmbannführer Witt standing, shaken, over the remains of his dead brother, Franz. Franzl Witt tried to cross the minefield and was torn apart by exploding mines. Play's company was already fighting right under the pass. Self-propelled guns could no longer support our infantry. We could not hear the explosions of hand grenades, but only visible clouds of smoke from them. The enemy's firing points were captured by our infantry in hand-to-hand combat, and the pass was stormed. The brave fighters of the Company of Plays defeated the enemy. More than 100 prisoners were taken, 20 machine guns and other military equipment were captured. Gerd Plays himself was wounded, but remained with his grenadiers until the end of the battle. The gates to Greece were open. However, the fighting continued. The 1st Battalion of our SS Motorized Infantry Brigade Leibstandard Adolf Hitler attacked the retreating enemy at a furious pace. Enemy tanks were destroyed by anti-tank and self-propelled guns. Enemy planes tried to interfere with our offensive, but their bombs did not achieve the desired effect by the British because of the difficulty of bombing in the mountains. SS Hauptsturmführer Fendt, commander of a battery of 88mm guns, was captured and spent the night in a British column. At dawn, our infantry freed him, and at the same time captured a significant number of New Zealanders. Early in the morning, the southern descent from the pass was taken. Large forces of the British and Greeks tried to regain what they had lost and push the Germans back over the pass. The British had a large number of tanks at their disposal, and they seriously threatened our vanguard. The 1st Battalion of the SS Leibstandard Adolf Hitler Motorized Infantry Brigade had already entered the open area, and our self-propelled guns were still on the mountain road, which created a dangerous situation. The first enemy tanks were already halfway from the lead company when SS Obersturmführer Naumann suddenly appeared with his two 88mm guns, opened fire and put an end to the nightmare. British tanks one by one flew into the air or, smoking, froze. The tank attack was drowned in fire, death and debris. While the 9th Panzer Division was moving south, my reconnaissance battalion rushed in the direction of Lake Kastoria. The shadows of the night were already surrounding us when we saw the dark mountains and the Klazura Pass we needed. Our goal was the city of Korcha and the headquarters of the 3 Greek Corps, but before that we had the Klazura Pass in front of us, which in itself was a serious obstacle to equipment, not to mention the opposition of the enemy. When we climbed to a height of almost 1,400 meters, the surrounding mountains seemed to press down on us. The progress was fast, the 2 ridges stretching in front of us were overcome in the next half hour. In front of us lay a wide mountain range, along it there was a winding road, going up in a series of narrow serpentine meanders. There was no turning back, it was impossible to turn back. On the left, the mountains dropped steeply into a gorge, while on the right, sheer cliffs rose skyward. The small mountain villages seemed extinct and abandoned. In the last village, its inhabitants looked at us with horror. Their faces expressed a question and expectation. A terrible tension gripped us. The smell of exhaust fumes filled the clean mountain air. The next ridge appeared right in front of us in several rows. The road slightly deviated to the right, and then passed over a bridge through a narrow but deep gorge. We carefully maneuvered in the direction of the turn of the road. At any moment, we expected a hail of bullets or rocks raining down on us from above. We felt like we were walking on hot coals. The vanguard stopped. The soldiers hid behind shelters and prepared to open fire. What was going on? No one had opened fire yet. Overcome by nervous tension, I ran forward. Suddenly a chasm opened up in front of us on the road. The bridge over the gorge was blown up. The massive stone span of the bridge lay in a pile of stones at the bottom of the gorge and formed a low saddle. We were surprised that the obstacle was not guarded and there were no signs of enemy positions. We cautiously made our way forward to the collapsed saddle. The gorge was probably 15 meters wide, and it could easily be crossed by foot soldiers. However, it was impassable for motorcycles. The lead platoon was ordered to cover the far end of the bridge and ensure the safe construction of a temporary bridge. As soon as the grenadiers reached the wreckage of the bridge, machine gun bullets whistled around us. We were able to distinguish the enemy's positions to our right, on the top of the mountain. Flashes of lights from machine gun barrels indicated their location. Mines whizzed through the air and exploded in the gorge behind us. It was the enemy mortars that tried to drive us away from the obstacle. My battalion got into a very unpleasant situation. It could neither move forward nor back. There was no alternative. We were on the only road going through the mountains to the rear of the 3rd Greek Corps. Overcoming such a mountain range was really only up to the mountain infantry units, and not the reconnaissance battalion of the motorized brigade, but these reflections were absorbed by current events. There were no mountain troops at hand, so we had to do their work, and we did it. Both of our motorcycle companies attacked enemy positions at dawn, while I continued driving along the road with drivers, headquarters, and a company of armored vehicles, distracting the enemy's attention from the direction of the main attack. We will need heavy weapons and artillery only later. Meanwhile, darkness was falling on the gorge. The enemy from time to time opened disturbing fire on the obstacle. Our sappers, in order to level the approaches to the former bridge with an explosion, drilled holes for explosive charges. An explosion, and in a matter of seconds, masses of earth and stones collapsed into the gorge on top of the wreckage of the bridge. Now my mobile reconnaissance battalion has turned into a construction battalion. Strong grenadiers dragged boulders and dropped them down on the wreckage of the bridge. A live conveyor passed stone by stone. Soon after, the first anti-tank gun passed over the temporary bridge. As soon as the new bridge was completed, 2 motorcycle companies began climbing the mountain range. Motorcyclists have become mountain rangers. The grenadiers had to climb up to 800 meters before attacking the enemy's pockets of resistance. Both companies were going to the assault. Each of them, separated from the other by a chasm, had to act independently. Although they went on separate routes, they had a common goal, the pass. Now the enemy was in front of us. The fatigue of the soldiers was blown away like the wind. Nerves were tense, all instincts for action were sharpened. Our soldiers used traditional tactics used in difficult terrain, supported each other, found ledges for support when climbing. Kraw's company also moved away from the precipice to the right and climbed the mountain. It had to go the longest way. I took care of the squad that was supposed to be advancing along the way. It consisted of 30 fighters. We had several armored vehicles, anti-tank guns, and a squad of 88mm anti-aircraft guns at our disposal. The road serpentine went higher and higher, and we had no communication with other companies at all. It was quiet. Nothing disturbed the silence of the night, not a single shot was fired. The moon had disappeared behind the mountains, and the night was getting darker and darker. Judging by the map, we had reached a large bend in the road, which was supposed to go around the last rock to the enemy's rear. His position should have been high above us. Our plan was to bypass his flank and cut off his escape routes. The road turned around the mountain and stretched for another 400 meters in a northerly direction before turning west again, towards a group of peasant houses. Near these houses there was a pass where the road crossed the crest of the ridge, and then descended to Lake Castoria. I didn't dare to move forward any further. I had a feeling that something was wrong. It was necessary to wait for dawn. It was windy and cold on the pass. We were pressed tightly against the rock. Naumann's platoon pulled an 88mm anti-aircraft gun to the position, so that it could cover peasant houses and the crest of the ridge with its fire. Gradually it became unbearably cold. Since we had neither overcoats nor blankets, we suffered greatly, shivering from the cold. Sleep was out of the question. If only I could at least smoke. The radio car was slowly crawling up. Under his cover, I smoked and studied the map again. The longer I looked at her, the more I trembled. At first I thought my teeth were chattering because of the terrible cold, but then I realized that I was very scared. The more time passed, the more tense I became. I couldn't be in the car anymore. The radio transmitter with its endless beep, beep, beep was getting on my nerves. Outside, I tried not to talk to anyone. I was afraid that someone would hear my teeth chattering and realize that I was scared. We all huddled silently behind the rock, peering into the darkness. Were my comrades afraid too? I did not know. Motorized Rifle John from the 1st Company of the SS Reconnaissance Unit arrived with a report. However, he didn't look scared. He briefly and clearly reported the situation to me, and then they gave him a sip of alcohol from the flask of a medic. It became lighter. Soon we could distinguish the outlines of the village. The attack of our 3 combat groups was to begin with the fire of 88mm guns. I bent down behind the shield of the cannon and tried to see something in the dark through binoculars. The closer the time to open fire approached, the stronger my confidence in the success of the attack grew. She just had to be successful. I counted on the fact that the enemy had learned the basics of military science at the military academy and predicted what measures we could take in this case. From everything the Greek commander has been taught, he will expect me to move my motorized unit along the road. That's why I will attack him through 2 ridges, and on the road I will only undertake a distracting attack. As the shadows of the night faded, the outlines of houses could be discerned. Pressing myself to the ground, I gave Naumann the order to open fire. In a matter of seconds, we were like in a boiling cauldron of a witch. The 88mm anti-aircraft gun sent shell after shell along the ridge to our right. Mortars and infantry guns also showered the defenders with mines and heavy shells. High above us, motorcyclists stormed the enemy's defensive positions. I couldn't see the 2 motorcycle companies attacking, but I could hear the fierce machine gun fire and the explosions of their grenades. The commander of a battery of heavy howitzers informed me that he could no longer provide fire support to attacking companies without endangering the personnel of the calculations. The guns took up positions along the mountain road, one after the other. But due to the fact that the road was too narrow, they could not fix their coulters in the ground. The commander refused to accept responsibility. This kind of stupidity was the last straw in the cup of my patience. In anger, I ordered him to open fire. We had to do it. Heavy shells rumbled over the first ridge and exploded on enemy positions on each side of a small mountain village. The enemy's machine gun fire slashed hail along the road and on the rocks above us, causing a rock fall down the slope. The stones rumbled around us. There was nothing to do but move forward. We quickly, jumping like frogs, rushed to the first turn of the road and took cover, having overcome a few more meters ahead, behind a rock. At the next turn, we will be directly under the enemy's position 100 meters above. After such a sprint, I collapsed, exhausted, behind a stone block and gasped for air. Our progress was hampered by the fact that we had to run from one pile of stones to another, using them as shelters so as not to become a target for enemy snipers. We could hear the screams and furious sounds of battle above us. The units of the 2nd Company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion broke through to the enemy positions on the first ridge. We rushed forward. At the last big turn of the Serpentine Road, we came across several soldiers who were separated from the rest of the company during the attack. Among them was SS Untersturmführer Warstery, who briefly reported to me about the operation on the Ridge. From the information from the prisoners, we learned that we were opposed by a reinforced infantry regiment located on the left flank of the Greek defense. His task was to hold the Klazura Pass, ensuring the withdrawal of the 3rd Greek Corps from the Albanian front, which was withdrawn to avoid encirclement by German motorized units and continue the battle for Greece in cooperation with British forces. It was impossible to allow the implementation of the Greek plan. The withdrawal not only had to be prevented, but also to suffer a complete failure. We had to complete the crossing of the mountains and block the valley beyond Kastoria. We continued to move along the road. Suddenly, the ground in front of us shot up. I couldn't believe my eyes. In the very place where the road had just been, a huge funnel formed. The road ended in an abyss. Sweat left bright streaks on our faces. We were horrified. After all, in the next few seconds we could also blow up into the air. After another 100 meters, the ground shook again, and when the dust settled, there was another giant crater on the road. We hid behind the rocks, not daring to move. Nausea choked me. I shouted to Emil Varvazinek that we should attack. But good old Emil looked at me as if he doubted that I was normal. Machine gun fire cut through the rocks in front of us. Our main unit consisted of only 10 soldiers. Damn it! Of course, we couldn't stay here, while craters from explosions form on the road, and machine gun fire presses us to the rocks. However, I, like everyone else, hid in a shelter and was afraid for my life. How could I order Varvzanek to go first? Continuing to worry, I felt the smooth roundness of an egg-shaped grenade in my hand. I called out to the group. Everyone looked at me stunned when I showed the grenade, pulled the pin and it rolled to the last grenadier. I have never seen such a friendly leap forward. As if bitten by a tarantula, we tore through the rocks and jumped into the newly formed funnel. The state of stupor was broken, the grenade did its job. We grinned together and rushed forward to a new shelter. At the top of the ridge, our attacking companies went deeper and deeper into the defense of the Greeks. Our 88mm guns were in clouds of dust and smoke from the bursting shells of the mountain artillery of the Greeks, but Naumann's anti-aircraft guns continued to fire. The shells of anti-aircraft guns pierced the road for us, burying the pockets of Greek resistance under piles of rubble. We were right under the crest of the ridge. Sweat blurred my eyes. I watched the fight through a veil of dust and dirt. We rushed like mad to the ridge. The Greeks were getting out of their positions, raising their hands up, stopping resistance. Their escape route was already covered by the fire of the 2nd Company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion, whose machine guns directly fired at enemy positions from a commanding height. My soldiers broke the resistance of the Greeks, supported by a battery of mountain guns, with the help of hand grenades. We made the trek through the mountains at the limit of our strength. My grenadiers did what others thought was impossible and what even today is considered madness. Klazura Pass is ours. But there was no time for a break. Only a swift pursuit of the enemy would bring us complete victory. Our sappers blasted rock fragments into craters on the road. The artillery changed position and fired at the retreating enemy. Whole columns retreated to the west and further south. The resistance of the Greeks, who, as a rule, bravely, until their last breath, held their positions, was broken. We captured more than 1,000 people, including a regimental and 3 battalion commanders. Only then did the full strategic importance of the position we had captured become clear to us. From the pass we could directly see the escape routes of the Greek troops from Albania, to which all our weapons were now directed. I wanted to move on after the fleeing enemy, but again on the road descending steeply, explosions thundered that stunned us. Precious time was lost on filling giant craters from land mines. The 2nd Company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion first went along the road and entered a small village. All its inhabitants left their homes and left. I wanted to regroup my battalion there, and then move along the main route of retreat of the Greeks. I was waiting for the 1st Company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion. Soon, young soldiers appeared. I could tell by their faces. They carried the remains of their company commander on a blood-soaked raincoat tent. Rudolf Schroeder was lying in front of me, his chest was torn to pieces. He achieved outstanding military successes, but was killed during the breakthrough of the enemy's defense system, commanding the lead assault group. We descended from the mountains in the late afternoon and explored the approaches to Kastoria, a town on the shore of the lake of the same name at an altitude of 630 meters above sea level. I wanted to conduct a reconnaissance and followed the reconnaissance group. Before a small bridge, we slowed down. Further on, the height of 800 was visible, dominating the approaches to Kastoria, as well as the escape routes of the 3rd Greek Corps. There was no movement visible on the bridge, it had not yet been blown up. Suddenly machine gun fire was opened on us. War correspondent Franz Roth, who was walking with the reconnaissance group, suddenly cried out in pain. The bullet literally cracked his skull. With a bloody head, but alive, the correspondent was sent back to his colleagues. The 2nd Company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion reached the bridge at nightfall, creating a small bridgehead. The company conducted reconnaissance north of Lake Kastoria and met stubborn enemy resistance. The attack on Hill 800 southwest of Kastoria began at dawn. Again our shells roared over us and smashed boulders, but the Greek artillery was more powerful here. The bridge collapsed from a direct hit. We were lying at the bottom of the trench, pressed into the muddy ground. The intensity of the artillery fire told me that a sudden assault would not be successful. A well-thought-out attack was required. Around mid-afternoon, the attack was resumed with the support of heavier artillery and the 3rd Battalion of the SS Motorized Infantry Brigade Leibstandard Adolf Hitler. The battalion moved out to cover the Greek positions on the left and had to reach the main Greek withdrawal route before evening. In order to suppress the strong Greek artillery and help destroy the enemy's positions at an altitude of 800, U-87 dive bombers were called in support of my battalion. The operation was carried out with unsurpassed accuracy. U-87 struck enemy positions like birds of prey, making wide circles around the mountain, and then dived, with a howl, deep down. On the heights and the mountain range there were flashes from dropped bombs, there was a rumble. Mushroom-shaped columns of dust and stones rose into the sky, connecting with each other and drifting in a dark haze over the lake. A dense veil covered the mountain, showing the devastating effect of our bombs and artillery shells. Hell broke loose there. When the first bombs fell, the motorcyclists jumped out of their trenches and ran across the open field with difficulty catching their breath. Excellent shooting of anti-aircraft guns completed the work of U-87 and heavy artillery. It will be a long time before the Greeks come to their senses from the U-87 attack. By then it will be too late. The soldiers of the 2nd Company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion climbed the mountain and secured themselves among the rocks. The rest of the battalion rushed to Kastoria through a hastily repaired bridge. Unsuspecting Greek companies and batteries retreating from the mountains were so stunned that they did not fire a shot and voluntarily surrendered. However, one of the Greek batteries continued to fire and was smashed to pieces by us. The armored vehicles of our battalion roared past the Greek columns to the center of Kastoria. The chaos was complete. A local priest greeted me at the market square. I will never forget his brotherly embrace. Then I stank of garlic for several hours. At dusk, my brave comrades took over the defense of the northern approaches to Kastoria. Greek units marched from Albania to Kastoria after fighting with Italian troops. The Greeks gave the Italians a good beating, but now they were forced to withdraw under the threat of encirclement by the Germans. It was constantly raining. The thunder of a strong thunderstorm alternated with the roar of shells and bombs. Our strength was running out. We fell asleep right on the spot. The scope of our success became visible only the next morning. In the last 24 hours, my reconnaissance battalion has taken 12,000 prisoners and captured 36 guns. For the way my brave grenadiers showed themselves, I was awarded the Knight's Cross. The fighting with the trapped Greek army continued. The SS Brigade Leibstandard, having overcome considerable difficulties, took the Katara Pass through the Pinned Mountains and forced the 16th Division of the Greeks to capitulate. The surrender was signed on April 21 in Larissa. Towards the evening of the 24th of April, when I was in Ioannina, west of the Katara Pass, I was ordered to pursue the defeated British troops. My comrades in arms had just managed to get a good night's sleep for the first time since the beginning of the Balkan campaign. In the morning, they woke me up from a dreamless sleep. The fuel tanks of our motorcycles and cars were filled to the brim from cans taken from the garage of the Greeks. No one bothered to collect the Greek machine guns stacked at the Ali Pasha Mosque in the old Turkish fortress, as well as the myriad of weapons left in the city. The Greek soldiers who retreated here, through the mountain passes, from Albania, left their weapons leaning against the walls of houses, shaved off their dark beards and went to the nearest bakery. They came out with loaves of fresh bread, a bunch of leeks, and if they were lucky, then with a few fish strung on a rod. Then they wandered south again. We intercepted them. This interception once again clearly demonstrated to us the difference between the road of the winners and the road of the losers. These people, who used to be fishermen, peasants, shepherds, traders or professional soldiers, apparently were quite respectable people before the defeat of Greece. Now they were wandering chaotically through valleys and passes, returning home in disgrace. The war ended for them in hopeless confusion, even if we happened to see a lone colonel sitting upright in the saddle. It was decomposition. We were moving on and on. We were going to nail the British sooner or later. The battalion didn't stop anywhere, but along the way we asked a few questions in every village or small town. The one who managed to cut himself a piece of bread with fat spread on it along the way, until he ate it, covered it with his hand on top, so as not to eat at the same time a quickly adhering layer of dust and dirt. Only once, at the bay, I allowed myself a short stop. I found the orange groves here simply fascinating. The soldiers filled their helmets with fragrant fruits. We wanted to taste them and make sure that we were in the south. On a narrow mountain road stood an unfortunate pony of the Greek army, a white horse with blue shadows showing between its ribs. Abandoned, without a harness, on her last legs. She did not move, she stood like a monument to the defeat. Our armored vehicles and motorcycles were passing by it. The horse was also a veteran of a lost war, an exhausted, pathetic creature. Further south we moved, crossing the swirling mountain rivers, and saw unarmed soldiers enjoying the cool water in them. But we, covered with dirt and sweat, could not enjoy a single drop. We saw thousands of people lying in the shade of olive trees. Instead, we had to monitor the fuel level and the turns of the road. We had to avoid potholes and hold on tightly to the steering wheel when our cars bounced on potholes. Of course, we remembered the unfortunate Polish roads, but this road was a damn cheese grater that seemed to want to shake the soul out of us. Night was coming to replace the evening, and we still hadn't reached our goal. Straggling British soldiers and demolition teams scattered in front of us. The Greek peasants told us that the British were deploying studded ribbons on the roads to delay our advance, and it turned out to be true. Drivers swore while they had to change another flat tire. We made a short stop in a small town. The battalion could not attract attention to itself. The persecution of the British continued at dawn.